to scientific advances by project plus key results indicating dosimetry and epidemiology. And they are jointly presented by American and Russian scientists. Tomorrow morning, we then will demonstrate how ICRP, we in ICRP, Committee 1, Committee 2, several task groups, how we are using those results to develop radiological protection further. So this is the current philosophy of our workshop today and tomorrow. And with this, I would like to finish my short introduction. I wish us all a very fruitful discussion, very interesting results. And from the ICRP perspective, of course, we will very carefully look at those results and start already thinking what we are, how we can use it. And with this, I'm already done 1 minute before, yes. Sarah. And I would like to give the floor to the next speaker. I think who is next to present? Nataliya and Nolan, okay. So please look at the program, which is on our website online. Nolan, okay. It's yours. Thank you.
Thanks, and this can be a challenge for a guy who doesn't usually stand still when he talks. So hopefully everybody can hear it. So I'm representing the scientific review group of the U.S. portion, and we know that the SRGs work under the auspices of the JCCRER, and the primary goal is to critically review and make suggestions of the work of the investigators. And that happens, as you'll see on the next slide, twice a year. And I'll skip. Twice a year, and these guys will say that, I don't know, these are thorough reviews, like maybe 15 to 20 page reviews, and all the projects are reviewed with questions to be answered and multiple things. So it's a very stringent review compared to things I've been involved in before. So just to let you know, I think everybody's in the room. I'm in the room. I'm the co-chair of the USSRG. Bill Griffith is back there. He's here, been on the committee a long time. I didn't have the only head-on shot I could find of him was looked like a mugshot. So I went with one of his, I'm taking notes at a meeting. Ben French, who's one of the newer members, has made some great additions to our reviews. Derek Yokish, which some of you know, has had an impact on internal dosimetry. Unfortunately, Roy Shore, who probably most people know, at the last minute had to cancel the trip, but he'll be on virtually as we go through it. And Sergey is the ex officio member who's joined us in the last couple of years to help us review. Past members, looks like a list, if you know some of these people, of who's, guys with great abilities to review things. So here we go. This is a slide I already hit once. So twice a year, we get these reports from each of the investigators, okay, from the teams on the project. And they're rather substantial. And then we review those, and they get a bunch of questions they have to answer, and then they do that. So a lot of effort is put out by the investigators on answering and updating the SRGs, right? We also evaluated proposals on occasion. We don't recommend who gets funded or not, but we make a recommendation about the technical work of the proposal. Just to show you, there have been a few meetings where both SRGs, the Russian and the US SRG, met together. And so you see some, when you see those photographs between sessions, you'll see some pictures for some of those. So I won't read all of these because I only have 5 minutes, but I mean, these are things we did. You'll notice the words always come up: encouraged. And there's only one where he said discouraged, but I know a lot of the epidemiology work was encouraged and I hate to take credit for some of this because the investigators were doing some of it already, but the emphasis on some of these. Mayak worker dosimetry, the SRG was kind of crucial to saying, here, the direction you're taking is fine since we're no longer getting data from the Mayak facility starting in the early 2010s. And so this joint exposure matrix, which was another thing that they encouraged, that we encouraged together, right? So, I'll skip that. All these will show up if you want to read all my bullet points, but I don't want to take 5 minutes going through them. So the importance of obtaining individual data on cancer risk factors was encouraged and emphasized. It was already being done, but it was done to correct for the incidence of cancers and things. So the SRG was very big for support of continued operation of the whole body counter. One of the things we discouraged was not to study the radon background for the lower Techa River. And Derek's in here, so he provided advice on the skeletal dosimetry. So we encourage the increased dissemination of information about the tissue repository. You'll hear later from Chris Lafredo, who will give some details, I guess, virtually. The impact is we promoted interactions between dosimetry and epidemiological or biostatistical teams. I mean, they had to interact anyway, but that was strongly encouraged, particularly when you look at the mix of talents and skills on the SRG. So the SRG is looking forward to this after this meeting. We hope somehow that the data, at least all the data that can be shared, will be archived in an appropriate manner so that if we want to use it or someone else wants to use it in the future, they're able to get to it. There'll be a final report summarizing the 30 years of scientific effort. And we hope to see additional publications because not everything has made it. And so that's the end of my talk. And now I guess we're going to bring in Nataliya, right, for 5 minutes. And I might say, you noticed I was listed as a co-chair. Nataliya's listed as a co-chair. So we had separate SRGs, but we considered a team effort. Okay, Nataliya, we're ready.
You hear me or not? Yes. Yes, thank you. Dear colleagues, first of all, on behalf of the Federal Medical Biological Agency, let me express my thanks for the invitation to take part in this workshop as in introductory from Russian scientific review groups. Some history for beginning. Sorry. Some implementation of the agreement between the government of the Russian Federation and the government of the United States on cooperation in the field of study radiation effects in southern Urals began in 1997. Specialists from the Ural Scientific Practical Center of Radiation Medicine and South Ural Institute of Biophysics carried out the three first research projects. Then 4 projects were added, and since 2003, the project with Mayak Production Association carried out during 10 years. Evidence of the importance and widespread interest in this study was an article in Science in 2005, highlighting the results of the solid cancer and leukemia mortality in the Techa River cohort. In general, over 30 years of research, the following statistics presented in this slide can be summarized. Of course, the impressive statistic data presented are the merit of the project performers. However, scientific review is also of rather importance in such results. The main goal of the scientific review groups were to conduct thorough examination of the results obtained in each scientific project. So since 2008, Russian scientific review groups was represented by Federal Medical Biophysical Center specialists in the field of radiation protection and hygiene, dosimetry and radiation ecology, pathomorphology, including academician of the Russian Academy of Science, Leonid Ilyin, and corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Science, Angelina Guskova, whose scientific legacy is highly appreciated by the world scientific community. Regardless of radiation risk-specific data provided by ICRP publication 103, the world science is still interesting question. How reliable the system of radiological protection and risk assessment? Therefore, the main task of the researchers is to obtain the most valid assessment of the radiation risk. Currently, ICRP is developing a concept of the further development of the international radiological protection system, and this fact determines the importance of our scientific review. Features of work of the Russian Scientific Review Group are, firstly, development of recommendation for the practical implementation of the obtained scientific data in practice of healthcare and radiological protection regulation. For example, new science knowledge has already found its application in the practice of assuring radiation safety and protection in radiation hazardous facilities in terms of the development regulations for internal exposure in contact with plutonium. Secondly, conducting joint meeting of representatives of the American and the Russian scientific review groups, Nolan told about it, and for example, in 2013-2014, joint meeting of the scientific review groups were held, during which the results of the cooperation project were discussed. These meetings were very useful and it was very efficiently. And third, cooperation with international organizations, including ICRP, UNSCEAR, IAEA, OECD, and NEA. The main scientific results may be the following. Firstly, new approaches to reconstruction of external doses and dose assessment from strontium-90 intake. Secondly, dependence of cancer incidence and dose more than 0.5 among population. Third, linear dependence of the lung cancer risk at dose up to 0.2 gray among workers under the plutonium exposure. Fourth, new data of plutonium transport communication from the alveolar section to the pulmonary lymph nodes and other. We shall see these results today. And in conclusion, let me thank the ICRP for raising this topic for discussion.
Sorry, we just noted that we have to, someone has to moderate the whole thing. So thank you very much for this presentation. You got a lot of applause. I don't know whether you heard that. And the next one is following the online, the program published online is Mikhail Sokolnikov, who will give the next presentation. Mikhail, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. And I trust you can see my slides as well, right? Yeah. As it happened, I worked for JCCRER research program since 1996 as epidemiology researcher. And in this presentation, I will give a brief history of that part of research I was involved in. Yeah, so basically our epidemiology project was mostly concentrated on the cohort of Mayak workers, and the origin of this cohort is somehow shown here in this slide, with very brief history of Mayak operation. You see that it take 252 days for the facility to provide the first uranium plutonium concentrate from radiochemical plant to plutonium production plant. And in 184 days later, on August 29th, 1949, the first Soviet A-bomb was tested at the Semipalatinsk test site. And on the picture, you see that building where so-called the vessel stage of plutonium production technology had been developed. So this picture shows basically the levels of external exposure in Mayak workers by calendar time. In the same time, this picture also shows what kind of understanding of radiation safety actually was specific for different times. For example, during the period of 1948 and until 1953, the annual dose limit was in current units was about 300 millisievert a year, which represents some sort of understanding. And why it was this way, in my personal understanding, it shows that actually at that time in 1948, 1950, at that period of time, there was simply no source for information to be found on so-called late effects of radiation exposure, because there was not enough time between start of exposure and developing of effect at that time. And the strong sides, the strengths of this cohort are also represented here. First of all, doses of radiation exposure were individually measured, and for the doses, we have to credit our Dosimetry project, which was run in parallel to epidemiologic research, in terms of adjusting dose estimates for different types of dosimeters, different energies of the radiation, type of worker activity at workplace, and so on, and finally reconstruct levels of exposure for workers who had not been monitored for radiation exposure or with data missing. Another kind of exposure which existed among Mayak workers was exposure to plutonium containing aerosols, and unfortunately we had made this mistake too at that time, thinking that a sheet of paper completely protects from alpha particles. And unfortunately, at that time, nobody really considered dangers related to plutonium intake inside of the body. And as you can see, for example, two micro pictures here demonstrate normal lung and lung with plutonium-induced pneumosclerosis. And I believe you can distinguish between normal lung and plutonium pneumosclerosis lung on these pictures. And here you can also see on this diagram number of plutonium-induced pneumosclerosis diagnosed in Mayak workers over time. So that was the second problem, health problem, which was sort of determined in Mayak workers. In general, first effects registered in Mayak workers were so-called Techa reaction, and for example here, as blue bars, you can see number of workers diagnosed with chronic radiation exposure syndrome over time. Whereas so-called late effects, cancer effects, were determined excess as excess cancer deaths started to appear as late and as in the beginning of 60s, and peak of them, according to calculations, of course, they reached the peak in 1995, in the years 1995, 2000. Those were the reasons for creation of the Mayak worker cohort. By the end of 70s, it became clear that the most dangerous health effects changed from tissue reaction to stochastic effects. The number of workers who were employed on main Mayak facilities was sufficient to study late effects of radiation exposure with sufficient statistical power. It was possible to identify the vital status of the cohort members, and we had, for that time, we had sufficiently dosimetry information of sufficient quality. So it was year 1990 when two articles for the very first time appeared in Russian open literature. That was, surprisingly enough, that was actually popular scientific magazine Природа, which translates into English as Nature, but just, of course, some magazine with somewhat different purpose, which from Nature, Nature magazine we all know. And very, very soon after these publication appeared in open literature, actually several months after publication, first contacts with the US researchers who are listed here, Marvin Goldman, Dale Preston, Elena, first contacts with these people were established. And this activity later on turned out to become the JCCRER. The aim of the research, which was already mentioned today, the goal of the research is to provide scientific basis for improvement of the radiation safety standards, in particular for workers who are at contact with plutonium. What we needed to do is to obtain quantitative estimates of carcinogenic risks from both external exposure and internal exposure to plutonium, based on data obtained from Mayak worker cohort, using, of course, improved and reliable dose estimates. Let me give you a very, very brief description of Mayak worker cohort, which is anyway very well known for all people who were involved in this project. The total number of workers included in the cohort is slightly more than 25,000 people. The number of person years of follow-up currently is about 1 million person years of follow-up, with about 2,000 deaths from different kinds of cancer. The most of workers were from radiochemical plants, slightly more than 9,000 workers. And Again, very brief dosimetric characteristic of the cohort. The highest doses of external exposure were occurred among radiochemical workers, and highest doses of plutonium exposure occurred among workers from plutonium main departments of plutonium production plants, which are shown here: plutonium production 1 and plutonium production 2. For the results of epidemiologic research, what we obtain among other characteristics of late health effects in Mayak worker cohort was estimation of lung cancer risk in terms of both mortality and incidence. Well, incidence actually was investigated in terms of European-funded project, EC-funded project, but nevertheless I decided to show it here. So for both mortality and incidence, we obtained sort of very comparable figures, very comparable to those of acute radiation exposure occurred in LSS cohort. For example, lung cancer mortality per sievert, increase of lung cancer mortality per sievert in Mayak worker cohort is in very good coincidence between, for example, LSS cohort estimates. And of course, this comparison of acute gamma versus chronic gamma exposure was one of the main interests of the project. So, for example, for solid cancer, we see in Mayak worker cohort for chronic exposure in doses compatible with those in LSS cohort, we obtained risk twice as low as in LSS.
Mikhail, just 2 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you. More or less similar results we obtained for the leukemia effect, with risk of chronic exposure, which is quite lower comparatively to that of acute exposure. Getting back to lung cancer, this is dose response curve, if I can call this curve, for lung cancer and alpha exposure. And what is more important, based on this dose response, we also calculated the annual increment of excess lifetime risk of lung cancer for intake of plutonium at level of annual limit of intake per year. And as you can see, for different scenarios determined by start age of intake, almost for each scenario, this level of annual increment of 1 to the power of 1 times 10 to the power of -3, which is one of the basic limits of acceptable risk in radiation safety standards. This level is exceeded by the lifetime risk of lung cancer. we hope that those results were at least partially accounted for by ICRP when they increased those coefficient for plutonium in their current recommendation, which decreases the annual limit of intake for plutonium dioxide from 1,300 to 800 becquerel per year.
Mikhail, can you hear me?
In a conclusion, let me just mention the group of scientists who contributed mostly to, who contributed a lot to this project. From you see names from Russian Federation, from the United States of America, from Germany, from Great Britain, and from Japan. Thank you very much. I'm through.
Thank you, Mikhail. I hope you heard the applause, and I can assure you that those response you showed was a curve. Thank you. So let's come to the next presentation, and this is given by Alexander Akleyev.
Good day, dear colleagues. Okay. For any research, 30 years, it's a long period of time. That is why I would like to dwell upon to the evolution of the research performed within the framework of the agreement in the Urals Research Center for Radiation Medicine of Federal Medical Biological Agency of Russia. I would like to start with the fact that next year, the USCRM will celebrate the 70th anniversary. The center was founded in 1955 to provide the medical assistance to the residents of the Techa riverside settlements, who, as you know, was chronically exposed for many years as a result of discharges from Mayak into the Techa River. After the 1957 accident, the center was also involved into the provision of radiation safety for the residents of the East Urals radioactive trace. First medical examinations and dosimetric studies on the Techa River began in 1951. They were performed by mobile teams of the specialists of the Moscow Institute of Biophysics. Since 1955, medical follow-up and dosimetric studies have been conducted by the staff of the USCRM. The following measurements of environment have been performed over the whole period of time after the releases into the river and emission in 1957. Gamma fields along the shoreline, in the floodplain, and in the settlements, the level of water, foodstuff, contamination with the radionuclides. In 1987, a computer medical dosimetric database was created in our center. The findings of all previously conducted dosimetric studies and results of the medical follow-up served as the information base for the future project in the framework of the agreement. As you can see from the table, both post-mortem and in vivo measurements, including those of the strontium-90 and cesium-137 body burden for the population, were conducted with the various techniques. Tissue and excreta radiometry, bone and urine sample radiochemical analysis, tooth beta counting were used. Monitoring of the strontium and cesium body burden for the population has been performed since 1974. on the unique whole body counter. More than 20,000 people have been examined. A lot of exposed people were examined multiple times. I would like to note that Russian-American agreement was preceded by our collaboration with the Radiation Effect Research Foundation in Hiroshima. The collaborative project led by Dale Preston was carried out from 1995 through 1998. The project aimed mainly at the development of the methodological approaches to data collection and data analysis, the ways to improve the quality and completeness of the information in the database were evaluated. The formation of the comparison group was discussed. Special attention was paid to the sources of information on incidence cases and causes of death, their verification, and vital status follow-up. Within the framework of the agreement, our center has performed 3 projects. I would like to start with the project focused on the physical preservation of the data collected from 1951 through 2002. First of all, we are talking about medical records of the patients of the UICRM clinic. Over the 10 years period, 1.5 million pages of the medical histories and outpatient medical records were scanned and indexed. Other documents, in total 650,000 pages, were microfilmed. Principal investigators of the project were Nick Startsev from UICRM and Donna Kregel, Institute of Science and Education, Oak Ridge. The next project was crucial for the implementation of the agreement on the whole. The principal investigators were Marina Dyokteva, Lynn Anspo, and Bruce Napier. It is obvious that in 1950s doses to population were not measured. The project participants were faced with a very challenging task. The reasons for that were as follows. Firstly, it was a long-term exposure. Secondly, it was external and internal exposure. It depended on the place of the residence and the period of residency. Then, due to the various reasons, radiation situation changed over the time. I am sure that the project participants will tell us today how they coped with these challenges. The main point is important today that the project has been mainly completed successfully, and individualized doses for 23 organs for the population have been estimated for the members of studied cohorts. The development of the Techa river dosimetry system was critically important. In the table you can see the TRDS evolution. In the first version of the system, TRDS 2000, only doses due to the exposure on the Techa river were calculated, and only approximate estimates of releases were used. More detailed data on the discharges became available for analysis in 2006 and were used in the subsequent versions of the system. Moreover, additional sources of exposure, EURT and gas aerosol emissions of the Mayak PA were integrated. In TRDS 2009 and TRDS 2016, strontium body burden measurements were used to obtain individualized doses of internal exposure. Data on the location of the individual households were used to refine the doses of external exposure in TRDS 2016. Validation of estimated doses performed together with the European colleagues was very important. The following methods were used: thermoluminescent dosimetry, electron paramagnetic resonance, and fluorescent in situ hybridization. Epidemiological project was devoted to the assessment of the carcinogenic risk in accidentally exposed population of the Urals region. Principal investigators of the project from the American side in different periods of time were Dale Preston, Elaine Ron, Terry Thomas, Faye Davis, Dan Hoffman, and Dan Stram. From the Russian side, Mira Kosenko, Lyudmila, Krestinina, and I. The main task of the project was the assessment of the radiation risk of cancer and leukemia in case of chronic low dose rate exposure. The overview of these results of the project will be highlighted in a separate presentation. I would only like to note that the risk estimates were mainly improved thanks to the refinement of the dosimetric estimates, increase in the health status follow-up period for the exposed individuals, and improvement of the completeness and quality data used in the project. From the table, you can see that in the course of the project, the size of the cohorts, the number of cancer and leukemia incidence cases and deaths increased, the number of person-year almost doubled, the follow-up period was extended from 39 to 66 years, the number of cohort members lost to follow-up declined. All this resulted in more reliable risk estimates. However, some scientific tasks remained incomplete. In conclusion, I would like to express our gratitude to the managers of the projects for their excellent work throughout the 30 years of collaboration. Today, I would like to say special thanks to the members of the scientific review group. They were not only the reviewers, but also the participants of the creative process. They initiated discussions of the challenging issues, put forward some hypotheses, and thus helped us to solve the scientific tasks. And finally, I would like to express our gratitude to all the participants of the projects. Over all these years, we worked as a team that united not only the scientists, but also other specialists, engineers, technical assistants, laboratory technicians from different countries. Epidemiologists and dosimetrists worked closely together, and I'm sure that this was the key to our success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And you were a bit shorter than you should, so we are now more in time now. The next I would like to call is Bruce. It's up to you. 10 minutes.
Okay. All right. I thought, since this is the JCCRER Russian studies portion, and we've been already talking about projects by number, that I would go through and give everyone an idea of what these projects really were. The JCCRER, when it was set up, had 3 directions. Direction 1 was community health effects, the people living around the Mayak facility. Direction 2 was the worker health effects, the workers in the study. And direction 3 had to do with information technologies and decision-making for radiation accidents. Now, the DOE Russian studies are directions 1 and 2. Direction 3, they had a couple of workshops. They did some radiation accident joint exercises, but we're not going to talk about those guys. Project 1.1 which Dr. Akleyev has just described, is still to provide the radiation doses to the people living in the vicinity of the Mayak facility along the Techa River, in the East Urals radioactive trace, and other places nearby, in support of the epidemiology study. Project 1.2a, as has been said, Nick Startsov and Donna Kregel helped initially to gather all the information together from the paper records that existed when back in the mid-1990s, and make a computerized database out of them. Project 1.2b was the follow-on from that, again described to do the epidemiology work for these cohorts. We now call them the Southern Urals populations exposed to radiation, the super cohort. That acronym started as a joke one day in a meeting, and it stayed. It was a continuation of the early work started by Dale and others at the U.S. National Cancer Institute. Project 1.3 was a pilot study to look at the source term of the materials that were released from the Mayak facility into the Techa River. This was Yuri Makrov's idea. His idea was to look at all the environmental measurements, use modeling, and work backwards. Our scientific review group said after a year's worth of pilot study that this doesn't look like it's going to work. And they canceled the program. But the source term work continued between the people at URCRM and the people at Mayak, who actually got into the ancient records and were able to come up with a really good description of the actual physical processes that had occurred. And so we actually have a pretty good source term funded by the ISTC, the International Science and Technology Center. Project 1.4, again, a public study, again, dealing with Mayak and its releases. Yuri Makrov was the PI for the Mayak side. Lynn Anspaugh and I were the PIs for the American side, looking at reconstructing of individual radiation doses from atmospheric releases, not just the Techa, but the actual atmospheric releases, primarily iodine-131. I'll talk about this in a little more in another talk later. But we actually made it through a lot of information before the Mayak facility stopped participating around the year 2009. But we got enough information out of that we're actually able to use it in Project 1.1 to estimate the thyroid doses for the people in those cohorts. Now we move over to the worker side, Project 2.1, metabolism and dosimetry of plutonium industrial compounds. Valentin Kokrikov and Ron Philippi, who's from Washington State University, I live a block from WSU, was a study to compare the autopsy systems of the US Transuranium Registry with the Mayak work. And while that was going on, they also transferred a whole body counter from the Rocky Flats plant in the US to the Southern Urals Biophysics Institute. Project 2.2, which we'll hear more of today, the Mayak worker cancer mortality study, Mikhail Sokolnikov, primarily on the Subi side, Elaine Ron, Ethel Gilbert, Dan Stram, with Dale, to assess the carcinogenic risks to the workers from external exposure and internal exposure to inhaled radionuclides. This is the first study to really demonstrate statistically that inhaling plutonium is not good for you. Project 2.3 was one of the early studies looking at deterministic effects. As Mikhail showed us earlier, in the early years of the facility operation, that he said the average dose was 300 millisieverts. There were people who got sievert sort of levels of dose, or grays, depending on, I know Abel would want me to say grays. So, and they actually came up with some, they looked at the dose response models for acute exposure to radiation. This one was actually sponsored by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I should say that the JCCRER was funded by many agencies in both countries, in the Russian Federation, There was the Ministry of Health, Emercom, Rosatom in the US. Besides the Department of Energy was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NASA. They're worried about exposures of astronauts, and our National Cancer Institute. Project 2.4, Mayak worker dosimetry. From the Mayak side, initially Mikhail Gorolov and Evgeny Vasilenko from the Southern Urals Biophysics Institute, Valentin Kokryakov, Viktor Kokryakov, Anatoly Shadilov, Jack Fix, Bob Sherpels, eventually rolling it down to a name that you're going to see a lot of today. It's me again. Looking at the dose reconstruction, as Mikhail said, for the Mayak workers. Project 2.5 was really looking at improving the plutonium dose assessment methods. Sergei Romanov, Katerina Zaitsev, and Ray Guillemette and Guthrie Miller at Los Alamos. This was actually, it kind of preceded Project 2.4, but the numbering scheme is such that they were 2.5. But this was merged into Project 2.4 around 2010. Project 2.6 was molecular markers of lung cancer, looking at blood work. Steve Belinsky from Lovelace and Vitaly Telnov from Subi, again, demonstrated that you could actually look at certain cancers and see where that there was a marker, so that there was actually a genetic marker that you could look at and say, yes, this was a radiation-related cancer. Project 2.7 was similar, another radiation biomarkers program with Tamara Azizova. Tamara was at the UNSCEAR meeting. I don't see her this afternoon. And David Brenner. And again, they also demonstrated, there's statistically significant dose responses between plutonium exposure and things that they could measure in blood, with enough sensitivity that they could see internal exposures versus external exposures. Now, that was really quite interesting. Project 2.8 is the Mayak worker tissue repository. Evgenia Kirillova at Subi and Chris Lafredo, who will be talking to us later this afternoon, looking at developing, maintaining, advertising, and getting people to use a tissue repository for doing studies on human health effects of radiation. Project 2.9, a database integration program. Again, Mikhail Sokolnikov and Dale Preston and his coworker Eric Grant basically took what we called the sneaker net and put it together into an actual connected set of databases so that we could actually use this information without having to copy it by hand all the time. So that's my quick introduction. You'll be hearing more from me later.
Thank you, Bruce, for this great overview. And now we get into more detail. Now, before the coffee break, we will get a number of presentations on dosimetry. And after the coffee break, we will continue with epidemiology. So the next presentation is on the dosimetry for the Techa River cohort, Project 1.1. Elena Shishkina, she will present remotely. I hope it works.
Dear colleagues, let me present a short information about the Project 1.1. The strategy goals of Project 1.1 were as follows: to elaborate the Techa River dosimetry system, providing the individual doses for population exposed to releases by Mayak Production Association, to verify the approaches and validate the dose estimates, to provide an appropriate description of uncertainty of individual dose estimation. By the beginning of the project, a large pool of biomedical and dosimetral data had been accumulated by the staff of the URCRM. And Alexander Akleyev already told about this point, but this is extremely important because this is a basis of dose reconstruction. And this information was systematized in the relevant databases and the registers has been maintained and updated through the Project 1.1. And in this slide, you can see a short description of the database environment, the content of database environment. Information basis for those individualization was represented by individual data on birth, sex, and residence histories available for all cohort members. A registry of strontium in humans, which contains the data of measurements of biological samples, as well as whole body measurements and in vivo measurements of tooth beta counter for a large amount of people. Moreover, we have a household registry contains the description of more than 14,000 households for each. There is a distance from the Techa River and the list of residents who lived together in 1949-1960, and the X-ray diagnostic registry. The dose reconstruction process is based primarily on a large number of measurements of radionuclide burden in humans and on measurements of external exposure performed directly in place where people lived. The traditional approach of analyzing all steps of the pathway of exposure is only used as a backup when other approaches have been exhausted. This methodology is rather unique in the worldwide practice of environmental dose reconstruction. The author of concept, the ideologist, and the header of the complex long-term studies was Marina Doktin. So, internal dosimetry was based on two main scenarios. The first is the scenarios of the Techa River contamination, the contamination of the areas near of the Techa River. And the second is contamination of East Urals radioactive trace, populated areas of the East Urals radioactive trace. The key parameters for Techa River scenario are the dose rate on the shoreline and its decrease with distance. For 1950 and 1951, just a small amount of dose rate measurements were available only. So the model of radionuclide transport were created and used. For the subsequent period, the semi-empirical model was used, taking into account large amount of experimental data on regular monitoring of dose rate. The key parameter for dose reconstruction in East Urals radioactive trace scenario is the surface contamination of the soil based on the averaged measurement results. The important parameters for both scenarios are behavior of residents depending on age and let's do it. The main scientific achievements in external exposure dosimetry was the calculation of age-dependent dose factors to convert the dose in the air at 1 meter above the ground into dose in target organs. The coefficients were obtained for 23 organs considered in TRDS, as well as for tooth enamel to support IPA tooth dosimetry. The work was carried out in collaboration with specialists of Florida University. The basic concept of internal radiation dosimetry includes the calculation of group average doses typical of a certain sex and age for a person based on reconstruction of radionuclide intake and combination of biokinetic and dosimetric modeling. And those doses are then individualized using measurements of 19 strontium content either in the person body or in the body of his or her family members. When creating a system for calculation calculating internal radiation doses, an original method for reconstructing the relative intake was developed using in vivo measurements of beta activity in teeth with tooth beta counter. This task also a step forward in inverse problem solution, in mathematics. Another contribution into development in internal radiation dosimetry methods was sex and age-specific biokinetic model for strontium. The model was developed based on extensive measurements of 19 strontium in the body of residents of the Techa River. As can be seen from the figure, the ULCRM model is less conservative than ICRP model and well describes numerous experimental data. For dosimetric modeling of bone marrow exposure to incorporate beta emitters, a model of microarchitecture of trabecular bone was developed. A method and instrument for creating computational phantoms has been developed too. And a family of computational phantoms has been created, and those coefficients for strontium isotopes have been calculated. And this topic is can be a topic of separate presentation, I think. Among the main principles, there were a verification of components of the dosimetric system at each stage of development, as well as the validation of those estimates. TSDS 2016 is unique because it is well validated, which is atypical for retrospective dose assessment in uncontrolled radiation situations. This makes epidemiological studies with TRDS 2016 promising in terms of the reliability of conclusions about radiation risk to populations. There have also a number of achievements in the field of validation of those estimates. In the framework of retrospective dosimetry using TL on ceramic building materials, for the first time ever, the method has been used to reconstruct doses accumulated in the bricks during the prolonged period of exposure from radioactive pollution of the environment. During the time change in the environmental contamination and source configuration occurred. It was a challenge for those reconstruction. Monte Carlo simulations of exposure history were involved to support the experimental task. And the studies in the area of the Techa River can be considered as a testing ground for retrospective TL dosimetry. You can see the names of our collaborators in the frame of European projects in this slide. In the framework of EPR dosimetry, again, absolutely new methodology of EPR dosimetry has been developed for radiation situations with combined external gamma and chronic internal exposure to bone-seeking radionuclides. The method is combination of EPR dosimetry of tooth enamel, radiometry of different dental tissues, and dosimetric modeling of those formation in enamel from 19 strontium incorporated in the teeth. The name of our collaborator from Gengold Centrum Munich, ISS, Institute Superior of the Sanita, and Institute of Metal Physics are also shown in this slide. In the framework of biodosimetry using stable chromosome aberrations, for the first time, the method has been applied to assess non-uniform chronic exposure. The yield of radiation-induced translocation had been due to contribution of red bone marrow exposure and uniform whole body exposure to external gamma sources. Two approaches have been developed to interpret the results of biodosimetry. The first is the empirical dependence of translocations yield on red bone marrow dose. And the second, the concept of modeling the formation of and circulation of T lymphocytes. The name of collaborators with European projects are also shown in the slide. Over 30 years, 2002 scientific papers were published in peer-reviewed journals. A few more are in preparation. The results were presented annually at scientific conferences. And in this slide, you can see the principal investigators. In the left panel, you can see Lena Spo, Marina Dukteva, and Bruce Napier celebrating of 10 years of the project. And in the right panel is the 2020 year, Bruce Napier and Mikhail Smith checking the implementation of our plans. And I would like to say that all participants are grateful to the project for the opportunity to work fruitfully and efficiently to provide dosimetric support for the epidemiological studies and for radiation safety of people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and especially thank you that you demonstrated with your examples how the European studies complemented and supported also the studies from the US and Russia, and how they inform each other for the benefit of the whole project. The next is Bruce again, huh? On the same project as far as I understand. So please.
Again, the concept here is some joint presentations. So some of the key results of this dose reconstruction and things we might hope that people could do in the future. One of the key things that we spent a lot of time on in both Project 1.1 and 2.4 is estimation of uncertainty of the doses. So all of the doses that Elena just talked about for 60,000 people for almost 70 years for 23 organs have been estimated with uncertainties. The uncertainty estimates are kind of in a novel way because there are uncertainties that are shared between the individuals. What was the total release into the river? There are uncertainties that are not shared. How long did any one person spend down by the river? They consider different types of uncertainty. There's classical measurement error, the kind us health physicists are used to thinking about. You know, you measure something several times, you get slightly different answers. But there's also what's called Bergson error or grouping error, where we have a value, say a measurement in a village, and we assign everybody in that village that measurement. That's a form of uncertainty. And we try and look at autocorrelations over time between these things. And all of these are saved for the epidemiologists in our cohort files. And again, it's an awful lot of people with an awful lot of numbers that becomes something like a terabyte of information every time we run these calculations that I then hand off to Dale and he has to figure out how to deal with it. We've been using something called HDF5, which was actually developed at CERN for dealing with gazillions of interactions, which makes it something that we can actually deal with and get information out of. There are, in the Techa River dosimetric system, a number of parameters. When you look at all the years and all the villages and all the pathways, it's over 1,500 parameters, which we then characterized as being a constant, a classical uncertainty, a Bergson uncertainty, a shared uncertainty, or a group, an individual uncertainty. So all of those go into the two-dimensional Monte Carlo system. Now, 2 dimensions. The outer dimension is kind of the environment. It's the river and the conditions in the villages. And then the second dimension is you bring in the people. And so for every uncertain realization of the environment, you again run all of the people through them with their own uncertainties. And this is what we call a 2-dimensional system, and is what generates so much information. This is a picture of the doses. On the colored red line over there is the total dose using the TRDS point estimates. It's a cumulative distribution of all the doses of all the people. And on the right is just an example of the cumulative probability of 5 of the 1,500 realizations generated by the stochastic system. So you can kind of get an idea how much information there is and what the variability is, and also how big some of these doses were. And speaking of how big these doses are, this is kind of just a summary table for the Techa River and the East Urals radioactive trace cohorts for the arithmetic mean, for the active marrow, and the geometric mean, because these are log normally distributed results. And you can see the GSDs run from about 2 to 3, which isn't too bad. You know, we're within an order of magnitude for everybody. And you can see that the marrow doses are quite a bit higher than the stomach doses for most people. And as Elena said, the predictions as well as the models have been validated using thermoluminescence, electron paramagnetic resonance, and FISH measurements. So again, this is just one of the examples here. But we do think that these doses are fairly well validated and makes them fairly reliable for use. There are a number of things we would like to be able to do in the future that are not going to happen immediately. We were in the process of updating the bone marrow dosimetry. We have developed age and sex-specific dose factors for strontium and bone. We had the results available, but we haven't gotten them into the TRDS yet. We have created computational phantoms for the fetus, so we can actually do prenatal doses now, and those have not yet been incorporated yet. We'd like to update some of those 1,500 parameters. One of the most important ones is one called T1. How much time did somebody spend down by the river? Because we had a number of Russian references, people who had actually gone out and done surveys, and we collectively misinterpreted what this one meant, and the uncertainty band is wider than we thought, and we'd like to go in and fix that. We'd like to update the dose individualization. As Elena said, we have whole body counts, we have tooth beta counts, we have used the whole body counts to scale the results so that, for every person with a whole body count, we have a pretty good idea of what their dose is. There are a number of people who don't have whole body counts. We've been using household members, family members to estimate what their range ought to be, but more people have tooth beta counts than have whole body counts. And so we would like to be able to, and Evgenia Tolstik has developed a way to use the tooth beta counts as a method for individualizing the dose, and we have not incorporated that fully yet either. And we'd like to do some more verification on the intakes. Elena mentioned to me a couple months ago that there seems to be an underestimation for people after 1953. Want to fix that someday. So, you want to introduce me, or should I just go right into the next talk?
Just listen to your
These guys way in the back have got this all set up, okay? You get to hear me one more time today. I'm going to talk about Project 1.4, since this is the dosimetry section just before we get to the epidemiology section. This is reconstruction of dose to the residents of the city of Ozersk from operation of the Mayak Production Association, which was to look at the atmospheric releases, particularly iodine-131. Now here's a list of the goals that we had for that project. Develop the releases, look at the environment, figure out what people were exposed to, calculate the doses. This is what was completed before Mayak pulled out of our participation in about 2009. Basically everything except the dose calculations themselves. So we have an estimate of the releases of radioiodine into the environment from the stacks at the Mayak Production Association. This has been published. And I was the chief scientist for the Hanford site dose reconstruction in the United States, which is the analog for Mayak. And these numbers are pretty comparable to what we had at Hanford. We also figured out where local sources of food and milk were. you notice the little cross-hatched areas were collective farms. And those collective farms are, at least on the ones on the far side of the screen over there, are downwind, primarily downwind of the Mayak site. So, you know, some of the people in the town and in the neighborhood had their own cows and goats back in the 1940s and 1950s. About a quarter of the residents had their own private gardens. And so, but milk for the rest of the city and for the canteens and for the school children was supplied by the 4 collective farms that are illustrated here. We also actually finished up doses from non-iodine radionuclides. This is primarily argon-41. The reactors were graphite stacks ventilated with air, and the air would tend to get activated, activating argon-41 primarily. And we actually have estimates for a number of different locations of the total dose over the operating period of those reactors, and it tended to be less than 10 millisieverts. Most of them were much less than 10 millisieverts, particularly per year. So these doses have kind of been discounted in all of the other programs because especially the workers and the folks living close to the site on the Techa River had much, much higher doses than 10 millisieverts. But several years ago, we looked and said, you know, we can use this information, even though it never got quite to where we wanted it to be, we can use it for the Techa River group. And so we came up with an atmospheric dispersion grid, and using some surrogate information from recent years, there's a number of meteorological stations here that give us data. We picked several years to use as surrogates and added the uncertainty from the atmospheric dispersion. But what you can see is that this is a funny shaped grid. It kind of goes up there to the far corner. That's where the Techa River goes. So the really dense numbers that are kind of hard to see in the middle of the figure are the immediate vicinity of that last map with the collective farms, and the rest of it is actually the Techa River. And we came up with thyroid doses for the Techa River cohort. And this is the collective doses. And you can see at the very high end, these are thyroid doses of greater than 1 gray. So there were some pretty healthy thyroid doses in this population. And these are not the people in the city. These are the people outside the city. Now, as I said, really the key objective of Project 1.4, which was to estimate doses to the residents of the city of Ozersk, specifically children, which is something Nina Krestinina really wanted to have happen, didn't get done because Mayak left the project in 2009. We had all that data. We didn't do the doses for Oz, although I think we could, but there still needs to be some subsequent epidemiological studies that remain to be done. So, you know, there is a future if people want to follow it. Okay. Where are we now? That's not my slide, so I'm going to sit down.
Thank you, Bruce. We are in time. Thank you. And we are coming now to another talk on Mayak dosimetry. I think so. Wait a minute. Yes, sure. And this is given by Alexander Efimov remotely again. So could you please, Alexander, could you please start?
Yes.
Okay, we hear you and we see your slides already, so it seems to work. So please.
Okay, thank you. Dear colleagues, let me give you an overview of the goals, tasks, and main results achieved within the framework of the project Mayak Walker Dosimetry. I will focus on the key issues of the project and its latest results. In June 1948, the first plutonium-producing industrial reactor was launched at Mayak Production Association. During the first decades, the radiation situation at the facility was unfavorable, which resulted in significant intakes of plutonium in the workers and very prolonged exposure to internal radiation. The group of Mayak workers and the study includes 25,747 people and has the highest level of chronic radiation exposure among all known population group on the Earth. This dose reconstruction project is to develop a computerized database of individual internal and external radiation doses and uncertainty about those doses for each members of the Mayak worker cohort, and studying the project 2.2 Mayak worker dosimetry mortality, Mayak cancer mortality. The work product is an electronic database containing updated individual annual dose estimates called Mayak worker dosimetry system, MWDS. The basic assumptions. The main dose-forming radionuclide in the internal exposure of cohort is plutonium-239. The radionuclide chronic intake is under consideration, but acute intakes are not included. Dose estimates are based on urinary excretion of plutonium and workers' exposure histories and conditions. The calculations use a biokinetic model with parameters relevant to the conditions of exposure. At the early stage of the project, the source data was verified, the limit of nuclide detection were determined for different techniques used in different period of time. The method of alpha spectrometry was implemented. This slide represents the evolution of characteristics of the methods for measuring plutonium content in urine. The primary trend is increasing the sensitivity of the measurement technique, which was required due to a decrease of plutonium intake levels over time. The initial data set to find out the model parameters was the postmortem measurements of plutonium concentration in tissues and organs in relation to exposure conditions and health status. The main task of the project was the design and development of a plutonium biokinetic model, meeting the exposure conditions of the Mayak workers. The model has evolved from the simple reduced model of ICRP 30 to the multiple compartment modified model of ICRP 66. The approach to a model of intake and interpretation of bioassay have also changed. As a result, the new generation of dosimetry system MWDS suggests a significant modification for the description of transport of particulate compounds. The picture shows a piece of the model for the exchange of particles in thoracic and extrathoracic regions. Within the model, it's assumed that all absorption parameters depend on physical and chemical properties of the material inhaled, and therefore 100% common for all workers. Records on the Mayak workers have no information of fast phase of dissolution, so the values are derived from literature. Values of SS for nitrates and oxides were derived separately based on autopsy results. For workers who were in contact in plutonium, DTPA administered on a daily basis for 3 days had been used until the mid-70s to enhance the urinary excretion of plutonium and increase of sensitivity of bioassay measurements. In the Mayak worker cohort study, the enhancement coefficient values are determined and used in the biokinetic models. Based on aerosol activity in the air of workplaces, a 3-step function of intake was developed. Also, the use of respirators, which started in 1947, was considered this place. For many years, there was a program of individual biophysical examination, which had 2 goals: to examine and provide with those data the previously unexamined MWC representatives and to examine those representatives who at one time were provided with inadequate number of measurements and were examined using insufficiently sensitive techniques. They perform test calculation, quality control calculation, and final calculation. A program code named Pandora was developed. This is software complex used to process the initial data and calculate hyperrealization of annual absorbed dose to tissues and organs in accordance with worker history and exposure conditions. The contribution of americium-241 to a total dose increased in late years. A model was developed to consider the americium contribution. The model has been verified but not implemented yet in the dataset to be submitted to epidemiologists. The Mayak cohort is provided with annual estimated plutonium doses to different organs and tissues only approximately for 45% of the main production workers. A method for extrapolation of working condition of certain workers provided with estimates of harmful exposure onto the rest of the workers is called job exposure matrix. The task is solved for the majority of the cohort members, but it is subject for further development. Most of the work on the external dose database was performed by Mayak. Spot estimates and the uncertainties are obtained for gamma and neutron exposure, along with the dose from medical diagnostic exposure. After 30 and 10, the works were performed without Mayak data and participation, mostly by the method of reverse engineering. A hypermodel was developed for external dosimetry. The dataset obtained is consistent with the structure of internal dosimetry data, including the doses from medical diagnostic exposure. This is statistical information. In accordance with the project goals, one of the key indicators is the number of MWC representatives provided with dosimetry data. In 2019, the data on doses of workers examined by the MWDC 2019 model was submitted to the epidemiologist of Project 2.2. The amount of data is indicated in this table. The table represents the main characteristic of MWDC 2060 and MWDC 2019. As mentioned above, the GIM method is used to obtain those estimates for the majority of the cohort representatives. For external exposure, 500 realizations for each annual dose to each organ were calculated for the period from 1948 till 2007. The doses due to medical examination were calculated based on available medical records. This data is available for about 48% of workers only. The data supplementing is one of priorities for the future activities. The research of those reconstructions for the Mayak workers have been noticed by the global scientific community and mentioned in ICRP publication 141. This is our current Russian participants of the project and their role in it. For a long period of project, a large number of scientists have applied their knowledge and experience to achieve the project goals. We would like to express our gratitude to them. Thank you for your attention and long-term fruitful cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you heard the applause. And now we come to the last presentation before the coffee break. And this is now a presentation not from the US or from Russia, but from Great Britain, right? Okay, Richard, please. The floor is yours.
Which is it to move the slide, is it? The green one. The green one, okay, thanks. Right, I better move this down a bit. Okay, thank you. Alexandra has given a very good survey of the internal dosimetry for the Mayak workers. I'm just going to give a little bit more detail on one or two of the more technical aspects of the dosimetry. I've got three topics I want to cover. I think I might not get to the last one in the time available, but we'll see how we go. Okay, done that. The first and extremely rather knotty topic is hyperrealizations. One of the novel features of the Mayak internal dosimetry has been the rather elaborate statistical calculation that's been done taking into account probability distributions. I should say before I go any further that this work essentially was done by the late Alan Birchall and Matt Puncher in collaboration with Subi colleagues. Okay, so a standard calculation such as we might have done when I started internal dosimetry about 40 years ago. You assign default parameters to your biokinetic models. You run the models in forward mode using a dose of 1 becquerel. And you get a single answer, 1 dose per unit intake. To run it in reverse mode is quite straightforward. You use those same models to generate excretion curves. You analyze your excretion data. You use something like maximum likelihood estimator to come up with the best estimate of intake. And then you plug that into your dose per unit intake and you get a single figure, a single dose. And that's the end of it. That's the way we used to work. But it takes no proper account of uncertainties in the model parameters. And these can be considerable. So what you have to do is to assign probability distributions to each parameter. And then to do a single realization, you randomly select from each of these probability distributions. You then run the model forward and calculate a dose. And then you'd make another random selection and you do the whole thing over again. And then if you do it enough times, you come out with a probability distribution on dose per unit intake. So that's obviously more complex, but essentially straightforward procedure. And that's what you call a hypermodel. To run it in reverse, you then have to make selections from the PDFs for each parameter and then fit the bioassay data to get an estimate of intake. And then you can multiply it by dose, again, by multiplying the MLE intake by the dose per unit intake. However, some selections of parameters are going to give you a better fit to the data than others, and you can't really give these different estimates equal weight. You've got to weight the different calculations in a way that's related to the degree of fit that they give to the data. And to do this calculation properly, you need to do Bayesian statistics. So these hyperrealizations, what you do is you take your set of parameter values from a prior probability distribution. You use this set with your your measurement data and a prior on the intake distribution to produce a Bayesian posterior probability distribution on dose. You then repeat this procedure for the next worker using a different set of parameters for the parameter values for the unshared parameters, but the same ones for the shared parameters. And then you repeat this for all the different N workers in the cohort, and you come up with a posterior probability distribution of dose. And this is what Birchall and co. called a hyperrealization. And then you go through the whole procedure again for a different set of parameter values. The shared parameters stay the same for each worker, but are different from the previous realization. And then you come up with another hyperrealization. You run through this maybe 1,000 times, and you end up with these large number of hyperrealizations, and this is what Birchall and co. called a multiple hyperrealization. This is computationally quite challenging. The classic method of doing this sort of calculation is Markov chain Monte Carlo. But Puncher attempted to simplify this procedure using a method that he called the Welmos method, in which the probability distribution on intake is then weighted by the posterior probability on the measurement given the intake, the value of intake that you choose, and the set of parameter values that you use. And this posterior probability distribution is used to weight the different intake values that you select. And in that way, you take into account the degree of fit that each of these sets of parameter values give to the intake. There are some technical problems with Welmos. It doesn't work so well when you've got a mixed regime of intakes, of chronic intakes, of acute intakes. So a simplified procedure was developed called the complex intake regime, where you represent all these, you feed in all these different intake regimes, chronic, acute, and so on. And then you shift the entire pattern up and down, but you don't alter the different components independently. And that allows you to have a look at cases with complex intakes, but without the computational nightmare of letting all the different components vary independently. Okay, so the output of this model is a set of maybe 1,000 hyperrealizations, where each of these is a set of probability distributions on dose. This multiple hyperrealization contains all the information on parameter uncertainty. The problem is it produces so much data that you have to kind of simplify it in a way in order to pass it on to the epidemiologists. And Alan and Matt and Subi colleagues devoted a whole separate paper to deciding how to do that, which I won't go into here because of time considerations. So that essentially is the multiple hyperrealization approach that was used to produce a full probabilistic calculation of Mayak internal doses. Right, so that's the first selection. The second one is to do with Mayak lung parameters. Now, Alexandra has already touched on this subject, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But there were two features of clearance, absorption from the lung, that they considered in some detail. Now, for all regions of the lung, it's possible to consider, except for ET1, it's possible to consider a bound state where material gets held up for a considerable period of time. So it gets bound to lung tissue and it's cleared from there at a very slow rate. And this bound state can have a significant effect on the dose. If the bound state was as high as 8%, it would increase the lung doses by perhaps a couple of orders of magnitude. The other parameter to consider is the slow clearance rate itself, which also plays a big part in determining what dose you get from a given intake, particularly dose to the lung. Okay, so clearance from the lung, particulate material can be cleared by particle transport, but some of it gets dissociated and dissolved and uptaken by the blood. Generally speaking, you split the dissolution into two different fractions, fast and slow dissolution in the lung. And generally speaking, there'll be a certain amount of the material will be cleared by slow means and others, the rest by fast dissolution. And that goes to the bloodstream. However, it's supposed that there might be a small fraction might get held up in lung tissue, and that's what they call the bound fraction. And as I said before, that could have a big influence on dose. So, Alan and Matt and the Subi team had a look at the data relating to the bound state. They reanalyzed some of the PNNL Beagle dog data. They reanalyzed one of the USTUR autopsy cases, subjected it to a full Bayesian analysis. And these gave various values for the fraction that's held up in a bound state. And they concluded that the data couldn't be explained without at least a small fraction held up in the bound state. And then they had a look at 20 Mayak autopsy cases and analysed these, and again with a Bayesian analysis. And they came up with a 95% confidence interval on the bound fraction between 0.01 to 0.3% of the material being absorbed from the lung ending up in a bound state. With the fraction going to the bound state being between 0 and 0.4%. Okay. So the Mayak study came up with the best estimate of the bound fraction of 0.2% for actinides. And as for the uptake rate, it was so long that they effectively decided to call the uptake rate from the bound state to the blood of 0. And these values have made it through into the current OIR models. Right, the slow dissolution rate this work was mostly done by Matt Puncher. It's an important parameter for determining the dose that results from a inhalation intake. And when it comes to nitrates, there's rather disparate values from various studies. There's the Harwell volunteer study, which was done some years ago. The actual analysis, I think, was done by workers at Public Health England, as it was at the time. And they came up with a 95% confidence interval on the slow clearance rate of between about 19 and 23 by 10 to the minus 4 per day. A reanalysis of the USTUR case 0269 gave a best estimate of about 48 up by 10 to the minus 4 per day, which were broadly speaking in the same sort of ballpark. But autopsies on those 20 Mayak workers exposed to nitrate gave a confidence interval of about an order of magnitude lower. And the problem that Matt addressed was, how do you reconcile those disparate estimates? I think one of the problems was that the Mayak data really refers to what's held in a long time after intake, whereas the Harwell volunteer study was more focused on the early clearance. And so maybe it's not so surprising that there's a discrepancy there. In order to test the hypotheses, I think I need to go back. Oh, no, I don't think so. Okay. They had various hypotheses on why this discrepancy occurred. One was that material was held up in part of the alveolar region. Another was that instead of a fast fraction and a slow fraction, there was also a third, much longer held up fraction in the lung. And the final hypothesis was that in fact the Mayak nitrate was a mixture, in reality, a mixture of nitrate and a small fraction of oxide. So in order to test these various hypotheses, firstly, they reanalyzed the Harwell volunteer data. They had another look at the PNNL dog data, and then they looked at US TUR cases 269, 631, and 745. And after various studies of these sort, they decided that the best way of explaining, you got your thumb over the number, I can't. 5, okay, great, thanks. The best way of explaining the various data sets without conflict in various parameters was to assume the third hypothesis was correct. In fact, that Mayak nitrates consisted of predominantly nitrate, but with a small fraction of oxide, and that was about 0.14. It was their best estimate. It's occurred to me since that we now have fecal data, which I'll move on to very, very quickly, and maybe that could be used to help to validate this assumption. Okay, so finally, fecal samples, just what you want to hear immediately before a coffee break. Right. When you have an intake of radioactivity, you get excretion by urine, you get excretion by feces. Early fecal excretion arises from material moving to the alimentary canal via either direct ingestion or moving up the mucociliary escalator in the pulmonary system. Longer term fecal excretion is from material sequestered in the bile. This kind of biological stuff is actually rather beyond me, since my knowledge of biology never really moved beyond the breeding habits of the three-spined stickleback. So I'll pass over that in silence. Anyway, it turns out that there's a great deal of fecal data at Mayak, although it hasn't been used in the dosimetry calculations yet. But the key point from my point of view is that the ratio of urine to feces is very sensitive to solubility of the inhaled material. And so a study of the cases where you have both urine and fecal data can help you decide on the solubility parameters of the material. If you do a quick calculation on the urine to fecal ratio from an acute intake for both type M and type S material, you see there's a big separation. It's an order of magnitude effect. So it really is quite sensitive to the parameters. So far, the data from Mayak has shown large variation in fecal activities. Inclusion of fecal data showed that you tended to increase the dose, but does this mean that there's something wrong with the lung parameters, or is this an effect of the DTPA affecting the fecal activity? At the moment, we don't have an idea on this. I also did some modelling on artificial data sets that emphasise the fact that fecal data can be very useful when you don't have a clear idea on what the lung solubility is. And that, I think, you'll be relieved to know, is the end.
Thank you very much. So I think the last couple of presentations already gave us a glimpse of why we in ICRP are so much interested in those results and how we have already used some of those results and how we will benefit from the most recent or hopefully also future results. Well, anyway, we are now perfectly in time for our coffee break. We will come back in exactly 30 minutes and continue. So enjoy the coffee break, please. Thank you. Let us continue the second part of today. And don't worry, I will soon shut up again because I'm happy to announce that Sarah Dumit will take over as a moderator of the session. Sarah is from Los Alamos National Laboratory, and she's actually a mentee member. Oh, sorry, 5 minutes left. Thank you. She's a member of the mentorship program of ICRP. She's a mentee of ICRP task group 121, which is on effects of ionizing radiation exposure in offspring and next generations. And in addition, she's an intern of the scientific secretariat of ICRP. So thank you very much, Sarah, that you take over. Please.
Thank you very much, Werner, for this kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second part of our session today. And without further delay, the next speaker is Lyudmila Krestinina, and the talk will be Epidemiology Project 12B, Stochastic Effects of Environmental Radiation Exposure in Populations Living Near the Mayak Industrial Association, Results of 30 Years of Cooperation. The floor is yours, Lyudmila.
Hello to all. Sorry for these troubles. Dear colleagues, allow me to present a report of result of 30 years of cooperation within the framework of Project 1.2b. This you can see our collaborators from different projects. In this slide, you can see the Russian principal investigators, Mira Kosenko, Professor Alexander Akleyev, Lyudmila Krestinina, and from USA, the Dan Hoffman, Terry Thomas, Dale Preston, and later was the participants, the Faye Davis, Dan Strem, and Dale Preston was during all period of our projects. This is milestones and task of our project. The first 2 years, it was pilot phase. Were devoted to assess the quality and completeness of the data. Next period, the long through 2013, was devoted to the study of cancer incidence in the Techa River cohort. During this period, task was extension the follow-up period, expansion of the catchment area, increase in the cohort size, improvement of the methods of collection and processing of cancer cases information, estimation of solid cancer and leukemia incidence, PRR based on Techa River Dosimetry System 2000 and then Techa River Dosimetry 2009. In 2014, due to completion of the project with NCI, the task on mortality follow-up in the Techa River cohort was added to Project 1.2b, and following tasks were completed. In 2016, was created combined cohort by adding the EURT cohort members to the Techa River cohort. And cancer risk analysis based on deterministic dose of the Techa River dosimetry system 2016 was made. And the last period was have next task, development of methods to calculate radiation risk estimates and confidence interval taking into account dose uncertainty, creation of database with Monte Carlo dose calculation, investigation their application in epidemiological analysis, continuation of data collection. and also cancer mortality risk estimation in a combined cohort using deterministic and Monte Carlo doses, publication of the results. Data quality and completeness monitoring in the new super cohort, more than 60,000 members. This the short list of study cohorts. The first original Techa cohort created in 1970s in the URCRM includes people born before 1950 in the Techa riverside villages in the Chelyabinsk and Kurgan Oblast who lived there at any time during the period of maximum discharges from 1950 to 1952. Later, in 1997, extended Techa cohort was created by includes late entrants, people born before 1950 who came to the Techa riverside villages during the period from 1953 to 1960. And East Ural radioactive trace cohort created in 1989 in the framework of Russian project consists of the residents of 19 resettled villages in Chelyabinsk Oblast who lived or were born in those villages from the date of the accident up to resettlement from 1957 to 1959, and the residents of 14 non-resettled villages situated in the territory of the EURT close to the border of the resettlement who were born or lived in the villages during the period from 1957 to 96. Combined cohort was created in 2016. It includes members of the Techa River cohort and the EURT cohort. However, some people, about 1,600, are members of both cohorts. South Ural population exposed to radiation super cohort created in 2018 includes individuals exposed in the Techa riverside villages in EURT cohort and including offspring or in utero exposed individuals if they received postnatal exposure. Here you can see the time-dependent changes in the analyzed cohort and its characteristics. The pie chart shows how the size of the study cohort changed. The size of the combined cohort, highlighted in blue, is about 50,000 people and includes original Techa River cohort members, late entrants, and East Ural radioactive trace cohort members. It can be seen that the size of this cohort has almost doubled as compared to original Techa River cohort and is 76% of the newly formed super cohort. The graphs on the right show the significant improvements of data completeness and quality in dynamics. First, show the more than two-fold increase in person years from 400 to more than 1 million. Second shows the increased percent of known cause of death from 68 to 92% and decrease in the percent of those lost to follow-up from 50 to 22%. Third graph shows increase the number of cases of solid cancer from 700 to almost 4,000 cases. And the last graphs increase in leukemia cases, including chronic lymphatic leukemia from 27 to 86 cases. The results of the risk analysis of solid cancer in various phases of this project are presented. Over a long period of time, the size of the cohort, follow-up period, and dosimetric system was changed. For solid cancer, used stomach dose, and for leukemia analysis, dose accumulated in the red bone marrow. Using the example of changes in the ERR of death for 2013, we can see the effect of dose and period. Increase the follow-up period from 1999 to 2007 led to a decrease in ERR from the 0.096 to 0.0966 per 100 milligram. The effect of those changes is less pronounced. The switch from TRDS 2000 to TRDS 2009 over one period has also decreased the ERR value per 100 milligray from 0.096 to 0.090 respectively. Increase of the period in the use of TRDS 2016 led to a further reduction in the risk value from 0.06 to 0.05 per 100 milligray. At the same time, the confidence interval of all indicators overlapped and the differences were not significant. It can be seen that width of the confidence interval has decreased in the latest study. It reflects a decrease in the uncertainty in estimating the ERR. When analyzes the ERR of solid cancer incidence, the effect of changes in Techa dosimetry from 2000 to 2009 was not noted. Similar time-dependent changes of results are presented for the risk of leukemia, excluding chronic lymphatic leukemia. For mortality analysis, a large interval between analyses indicates large changes in the ERR values, which are associated with the effects of period, dose, and quality of cohort follow-up. A more pronounced sense compared to the stomach dose, increase in the dose to the RBM occurred in TRDS 2009. Mean dose increased from 3 to 400 milligray. It reduced the ERR for both incidence and deaths from leukemia. It is clearly seen that ERR of incidence in the one cohort during one follow-up period differs by more than 2 times, from 0.5 to 0.22 per 100 milligray. At the same time, a decrease in the uncertainty in the ERR value over time is also visible as the relative width of the CI decreases. So the main results of 30 years project are listed. Significant progress has been made in cohort monitoring. The follow-up period, cancer incidence catchment area has been expanded, and the size of cohort has been increased. These changes resulted in an increase in the number of deaths and person years, with increased statistical power of the study and reduced the uncertainty of risk estimates. Increase of the cohort size and the number of cancer cases makes it possible to assess organ-specific cancer risk in future. Risk analysis result. Direct estimates of the risk of solid cancer and leukemia incidence and mortality under predominantly low-dose chronic exposure of an unselected population were calculated. The analysis of risk values was carried out at a new qualitative level, which it is thanks to improving the quality and completeness of epidemiological data, uses of new calculation approaches that make it possible to determine the level of uncertainty in risk estimate associated with those uncertainties. The dose response for solid cancer and leukemias is well described by a linear model. The resulting risk estimates do not support the point of view of a multiply reduction of effect under low dose or low dose rate exposure. The observed ratio with risk values in the Japanese cohort is close to 1. The trend of increasing risk values with increasing age in the Euro cohort with chronic exposure contradicts the age trends observed in the Japanese LSS cohort and requires further investigation. The obtained estimates of radiogenic risk under chronic exposure are an important addition to risk assessment in case of acute exposure to improve radiation safety standards. In case of chronic low-dose exposure and taking into account the existing specific features of risk estimates and the parameters they depend on each, can be assumed that radiation protection norm should be different to correspond to the exact form and scenario of exposure. They also should take into account age and sex characteristic of the affected group. Over 30 years period, 34 papers have been published with our project. Here you can see the main participant of our project in the 30 years. The Russian and USA participants. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Lyudmila. So I welcome Dale Preston for the discussion of scientific implications. Thank you, Dale.
Hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been an amazing experience to work with these my Russian colleagues for 37 years, if we count starting with Chernobyl, but well over 30, almost 35 years in many ways. And it's a shame that we haven't been able to work together directly as much lately, but it's been an amazing experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the scientific implications of what's been done with the Techa in the epidemiology for Techa River and the 1957 accident cohorts, and the recent results, and some comments on future directions that I think would be very important that are done, whoever does them. So the scientific implications and impact, we demonstrated persistent chronic low-dose rate effects on cancer and other diseases in a large, unselected general population of men and women exposed at all ages. And this is actually a pretty low dose and very low dose rate cohort. I think many people expected you wouldn't see much of anything from this cohort, and yet we're finding risks that are comparable to those in the LSS for these chronic exposures. We developed effective, innovative follow-up methods in times of, mainly our Russian colleagues, developed effective and very innovative follow-up methods in these times of great social change in the Russian Federation and increasing concerns about privacy, which have been worldwide. And the staff, Nick Startsev and his colleagues, have done an amazing job of finding innovative ways to keep following up this cohort. And it has been a challenge. It's a challenge anywhere, but it was even more of a challenge given the tenor of the times. We developed statistical methods and implemented them and risk models for an intermittent follow-up times. I mean, they have detailed residence history for the Techa River cohort, and people would move away and then come back, and we had to deal with those issues. So we developed methods for that are applicable in other situations. We developed approaches to time-dependent effect modifiers for age and aged exposure. When you're working with chronic exposure, it's not like when you're working with the A-bomb survivors where you can just say, oh, there's an aged exposure and exposure is done. And so we worked on that. And more recently, as the dosimetrists developed these Monte Carlo dosimetry systems, we developed, with mainly Dan Stram, methods for allowing for the impact of dose uncertainty on risk uncertainties using Monte Carlo dosimetry realizations. And importantly, relevant to the ICRP, we provided quantitative risk estimates that can be used to update radiation risk estimates for radiation protection purposes and other uses. And I hope one of the issues I think that ICRP has faced is that much of what they do is based on the LSS. And now I think both of these studies provide very important data and in forms that can, I think, be used as we move ahead. Talk a little bit about recent findings. So we've just completed, actually it's been a long time we've been working to complete, but we started a couple of years ago to combine the Techa River cohort with the East Urals radioactive trace cohort created as a result of the 1957 accident. It's often called the Kshtim accident, but if you saw the earlier plot, Kshtim is not even in the territory that was exposed. And we've combined the cohort, and let me see if I can. And so it adds, the combined cohort has about 40, how many people? I can't remember, 48,000, almost 48,000 people. And there are about 16, back. How do I go back? Is this gonna go? No, let's go forward. So there's about almost 48,000 people in the combined cohort. About 18,000 of those are only in the EURT, and there's about 1,600 very unfortunate people that are in both cohorts, and these are people that lived, primarily people that lived in the town of Muslumova, which was the closest town to the release point, and then they were evacuated to another, not Muslumova, I mean Metlino, and they were evacuated to another village a few kilometers away that happened to be in some of the most heavily contaminated parts of the East Urals radioactive trace. So that's a very important subgroup. And then there's about 28,000 people in the Techa River cohort. So it's a substantial increase. And one of the questions we looked at in this work was, is there evidence that the radiation effects differ between the two groups? So if we just estimate a common excess relative risk at 100 milligray, it's about 0.06 or a 6% increase at 100 milligray. The dose response looks linear. If you look at the combined Techa River cohort, it's about 0.06, 0.057 there. If you look only at the EURT cohort, the estimate's a little larger. The cohort's actually smaller and has lower doses on average. But it's a little bit bigger, but it's also smaller. And if you look at it the other way, the combined cohort, where you combine the middle portion of the cohort, the people that were in both, with the EURTC, you see the risk estimates are virtually identical. Now, a lot of that's driven by that high dose group, but there's no evidence of significant heterogeneity in the two cohorts. So I think combining these cohorts does provide sort of increased information that is useful. In the paper, we talk a little bit about site-specific risk estimates and some other things. But anyway, this is an example of things that have been completed, sort of probably one of the last projects in the JCCR leading to publication for the Techa River. Let's see. So yeah, the combined cohort increases the power to detect dose response. We see a significant dose response in each subcohort. There are no significant differences over the subcohorts, and the average ERR estimates are roughly comparable to the lifespan study. But if you just look at the average numbers there, but there are no significant sex differences, whereas the lifespan study there is. And the excess relative risk increases with increasing attained age or age at death, which is a pattern different than the lifespan study. So there are definitely some differences. It's challenging to understand some of these things, but we've seen this increase over time, but we thought, well, maybe with time the pattern would change, but it really hasn't. It's been quite consistent, and we thought it's time to acknowledge that. So there's some questions that really remain, I think, that this paper raises. In terms of future work, this is work I hope will be done. I don't know who's going to do it. It's mainly at URCRM, but I think there is a need to finalize the red bone marrow dosimetry. And so we can update, so somebody can update the leukemia risk estimates, because there are some issues there. I believe there should be joint efforts by dosimetrists, epidemiologists, and statisticians to reevaluate the nature of the uncertainties in the Techa River dosimetry. I know I helped with Elena and Bruce on the paper that was just published, I guess, on describing the uncertainties. And I certainly had some questions as we worked on that paper that I think it would be worth revisiting some issues. I should say that I'll illustrate the impact of this kind of adjustment later, but in the Techa River, the adjustment for dose uncertainty doesn't have much of an impact, and I think it probably should have more of an impact than it does, and I think part of it has to do with those assumptions. We have developed, as it was mentioned earlier, the super cohort, Southern Urals populations exposed to radiation, which, as Bruce said, was a name that somebody made up as a population, as a kind of a joke, but it stuck. Basically, we should have extended follow-up. The follow-up here was through 2016, and there's certainly more follow-up to be had now, and there could be more in the future, and I'm going to talk about that on the last slide. publishing in the super cohort. Hope maybe we will get something done in the super cohort, but it's unlikely jointly, but it will get done. And I think there's been some publications in Russian, as I understand, and then updated leukemia analyses. And speaking of, let's see. So this is a summary of the data as of basically the end of 2016, that of the original 27, let's see, this is the deaths. Okay, this is just deaths broken down by solid cancer, non-cancer, solid cancer, and leukemia. So there's been it's almost 16,000 deaths, and of which 2,300 were solid cancers and 140 leukemias, and some lost to follow-up. That's been an issue. They've done a great job, but it's hard to do follow-up. And at the end of 2016, there were about 4,600 people still alive, and for men, and among women, there's about 12,000. And then if we make projections into the future, so I did this in two parts. One is through the end of this year, we would expect basically another 300 and almost 400 additional solid cancer deaths, not very many leukemias, and about 1,700 non-cancer deaths in let's see, in this period. And this is male and female, and forget the total. This is total male, female, that's male, that's up at the top. So actually overall, we expect about 700 cancer deaths. So it's a substantial increase if you just use the follow-up basically till today. And these are estimates, the actual numbers are going to be slightly different. If you did another 5 years of follow-up, you can see the cohort is decreasing the size. There will be about another 300 solid cancer deaths. So there's significant information that could be had by continued follow-up in this cohort, and I hope it happens. I think there's enough very important information to be had. And then also just using the super cohort, well, there's a lot to learn there, because that's another 20,000 people, and you can look at people who were born after 1950 that lived on the Techa River, because that's a lot of the additions. And that's a very important group. Some of them have in utero exposure, others don't. Separating out those effects is a challenge, but it's something that is worth thinking about. So that's the end of this presentation. I learned a few days ago that Mikhail was not going to do this presentation, and so I had to come up with something. And and so this morning I put something together, and hopefully I gave them the latest version, so there's a few less typos in it than there was in the original version. But I'm going to talk about 30 years of international collaboration on cancer risk estimation in the Mayak worker cohort, and what has been learned. And I think in the program it says about plutonium, but I'm going to touch a little bit on external exposure. I want to point out that things didn't start with the JCCRER. And in 1994, Albrecht Keller organized an issue of the journal, the obscure journal Science of the Total Environment, in which there were 11 articles about Mayak, five articles about Mayak and 6 about Techa. And it's very interesting to look at those articles, but I assume that it represents sort of the state of knowledge of the risks and other aspects, at least that were available to the scientific community. And there were some interesting papers in that. There was Ukladnikova published a paper on chronic radiation disease, sort of radiation injury and such. And basically in the radiochemical and maybe reactor, that was a little clear, but there's not much in this journal issue about the plutonium production facility. They talk about A and B and that. And they basically gave nothing like risk estimates. Nina Kochernikova did publish a paper on lympho and hematopoietic diseases, and that did include a little bit of a relative risk estimate. Again, this one focused on reactor and radiochemical workers, and they definitely noticed an increase in leukemia risk estimates. They were pretty crude risk estimates. And Khokhyakov, Romanov, and Suslova, I believe, published something on lung cancer. And this was focused on radiochemical plant workers only. And they, linear increase, that's just one word, increase in the risk. So that was, and most of these papers, there were really no risk estimates other than something very crude in the leukemia. Okay, then there was a paper by Bolotnikova on cardiovascular disease among male radiochemical plant workers. Basically, the conclusion was no effects of external exposure. They didn't say anything about plutonium. And Natasha Shilnikova, her maiden name was Komleva, the first author, mortality. Oops, see, can't type when you're in a hurry. I can't type under any circumstance, actually. Mortality from external causes in radiochemical plant workers. They said the rates appeared to differ from population rates in some ways, but there was no evidence of radiation effects. And that's what was available, at least as of 1994, when the JCCR got started. And also was mentioned earlier, starting in 1987, Russian groups of Russians with academician Elena would come to RERF, and that's how we met. And that led to, through Dr. Shigematsu, the head of RERF at the time, my and Kiyomabuchi's involvement with these studies, and then ultimately to the JCCRER and an NCI project that started at about the same time, not without some issues. But, and one of the things that was decided when they started the JCCRER was that NCI would handle external exposure and the non-plutonium related cancers in the Mayak workers, and JCCR would focus on plutonium. So, but very quickly, we all were working together. Ethel Gilbert worked at NCI. I worked with NCI, and Elaine Ron got funding from the NCI project. So it was really a joint effort, but it was two separate projects. I'm going to talk about, this paper was on the NCI project. Natasha Shilnikova was the first author, and these were sort of the first risk estimates, I think, that were published sort of in modern type cell risk estimates. And this, we used about 21,600 people in what I'll call the original Mayak worker cohort, 1948 to 72. But as part of the NCI project, we encouraged the addition of auxiliary plant workers, water treatment and mechanical repair, who had much lower exposures, very little likelihood of radiation exposure. So that was about 2,800 workers. So we used that sort of extended cohort. We were looking at external exposure, but we had to adjust for the effects of plutonium, and we didn't really have dose estimates. So we developed plutonium exposure surrogate categories, basically 6 categories, and we would use those for this adjustment. We also did look at the risks in the monitored workers and noticed that the monitored workers, in the period right after they were monitored, their risk of dying of lung cancer was very large, and also the risk of other cancers was large. So it wasn't exactly a random selection of workers to be monitored. So that led to the decision through all the plutonium risk analyses over the years to start the dosimetry, dose response analyses. The people would be at risk using doses from 2 years after they were initially monitored. And that has some important consequences, which we'll talk about at the end of this. But in this paper, there were 1,850 cancer deaths. About 1,740 of those were solid cancers, and about a little more than a third were lung cancer, a large proportion. And there were 124 lymphomas and leukemias, and about 66 of these were non-CLL leukemia. We found a linear dose response both for the lung, the lung, liver, and skeletal, is what we called it in this paper, tumors, and cancers, and other solid cancers also had a significant dose response. There was definitely some indication of a plutonium dose response for lung, liver, and solid cancer. This is for external exposure. but there was no indication of an effect for other solid cancers, an effect of plutonium, and we didn't find any indication of sex differences or other factors. So that was sort of set the stage. Okay, the external dose effects. The most recent paper was on external dose effects was in 2015. We used the full cohort as it exists today. Mikhail mentioned about almost 26,000 workers. Follow-up here was from 1948 to 2008. We used the MWDS 2008 dosimetry system, to the deterministic dosimetry system. We used the plutonium surrogate for the pre-monitoring period and plutonium doses for the post-monitoring period. We had about 1,800 cancers over other than lung, liver, and bone. There was, again, no indication of a plutonium dose response. There was an indication that if you were monitored for plutonium, there was this increase in the risk of cancer. So, but it wasn't, there was no dose response for plutonium. So this was some kind of selection effect and not very likely a dose effect. We also did a simple smoking adjustment based on ever, never, unknown smoking. And we observed a significant linear dose response with no evidence of a sex effect and no temporal variation. The excess relative risk for gray was 0.16, and as Mikhail noted earlier, this is less than in the LSS. And it contrasts with the Techa River data where the risk estimates are comparable. So there's some difference here, whether it might have to do with nature of the occupational exposures or whatever, but there's definitely an interesting difference here that one has to acknowledge. Now we'll turn to plutonium. I'll start with lung cancer. The first sort of analysis of lung cancer risk where you estimated the excess relative risk per gray was a paper by Gilbert and Russian colleagues. It was in 2004. They used the auxiliary plant workers and the original, they didn't use the later 1973 to 82 workers. They also used the auxiliary plant workers that we'd added as the NCI project. There were a total of 655 lung cancer deaths. They did some work with they used the plutonium surrogate so they could include earlier workers. And for the dose response, basically it's based on the post-monitoring doses for the monitored workers. And they found an excess relative risk per gray of almost 5 for men and almost 20 for women, almost a 4-fold difference here. They also noted that this seemed to decrease with increasing attained age, which is a pattern that you see, for example, in the lifespan study, but not in the Techa River. And then, so that was the first paper. The next paper was in 2008, and it was a paper that looked at lung, liver, and bone cancer risks. They used the original cohort, the 1948 to 72, and with follow-up from 1953 to 2000, but they only used the monitored workers and actually in this paper, they only used the monitored workers. So there's fewer lung cancer deaths, but those are the ones that contribute to your plutonium dose response estimate. They used the MWDS 2005 dose estimates. The earlier ones, I think they used, I don't know what dose estimates they were, the 2004 paper, I can't remember, but they were very early dose estimates and there were definitely changes. They had a relative risk of 7 for men and 15 for women. So again, this huge difference, not quite as large as sex ratio, decreasing with attained age. And then in 2013, another analysis in which they used the extended Mayak worker cohort, the newer dosimetry estimates, the 2008 dosimetry estimates. They focused on monitored workers and unmonitored reactor and auxiliary plant workers through 2008. There were almost 500 lung cancer deaths. They did the same kind of smoking adjustment. And this is the result. The ERRs here and all the others have been at age 60. So at age 60, the ERR per gray is about 7.5, and it's about 24 in women. Again, this large difference for men and women. And here, the decrease was proportional to 1 over age to the age cubed. So there's a very rapid decrease with increasing attained age in the plutonium risk. And that pattern of decrease has been consistent throughout this time period. In 2021, Dan Stram and myself and others, and Mikhail did another analysis we used the full cohort, including reactor workers, the unmonitored workers, everybody. And we estimated lung cancer risks using the new Monte Carlo dose estimates. And again, the surrogate was used for the unmonitored workers. We used the smoking adjustment, only this time we used more detailed information on duration and intensity that was collected at the urging of the SRG and others. And we found ERRs of 3.5 for men and about 9 for women. So again, you have this 2.5, threefold increase, the same kind of decrease with attained age. And the doses are a little bit higher with MWDS 2016 than earlier. So the risk estimates are lower, somewhat lower than in advance. And the dose uncertainty did increase the upper confidence bounds. I'm going to show a plot here. This is the top row is male and female plutonium risk. The two sort of parabolic curves, the purple and the yellow, are sort of your traditional likelihood bounds. And basically, this is a bunch of confidence intervals. And that line where it crosses those curves is the 95% bound. And you can see that the upper bound is, for males, is about 5.5 under the traditional statistical analysis, and almost 10 for the, after you adjust for dose uncertainty. The lower bound is lower. We actually have a better method now that there's a problem, but basically the lower bound isn't going to change very much if you do the modern approach. But the upper bounds definitely increase dramatically. You don't see much of a change for the external dose in terms of this adjustment, and that's largely because the external doses are based on individual film badge measurements, with uncertainties arising because of conversion from film badge to organ dose. And so you would probably, this is not unexpected. Okay. Looking at liver and bone, there are larger risk estimates for monitored workers that they didn't use doses in 2000. This was sort of the first papers published under the JCCRER project on risk estimation, or looking at risk. I wouldn't say risk estimation, but they basically compared monitored workers with higher measured activity to those with lower measured activity, and they found a fairly large increase in the risk in the higher measured activity. They did not make dose response estimates. So the first paper, which had dose response estimates, was the 2008 paper with Sokolnikov, and they used only the post-monitoring radiochemical and plutonium workers, and using the MWDS 2005 follow-up through 2000, as they said. Oh, and also, I should have said this before, it says that follow-up begins in 53. That's because Ethel would routinely drop the first 5 years of follow-up because of latent period ideas, I think. So there were, in the full cohort, there were 75 liver cancer deaths. 40 of them were in these monitored workers, and there were 30 bone cancer deaths, and 11 of them were in the monitored workers. They found a linear excess relative risk, no evidence of nonlinearity, no evidence of effect modification. Well, sex, there's effect modification, but age and other factors. ER of about 3 for men and almost 30 for women, so a huge sex difference here. For bone, basically, it's a highly nonlinear dose response with significant effects only seen at the highest dose categories. And I'll come back to liver, and we hope, one of the plans we had was to do something on bone, and we might get that done before things absolutely end, but if not, Mikhail, I'm sure, will do this. And I think that's the end of this part of the presentation. So, I'm sure Mikhail would have given a very different talk, but I hope this is says something. So, okay, and now, okay, so this is the talk like the one I gave about Techa, only for Mayak. So the same ideas. We're going to talk about the scientific implications of what has been learned, some recent results, and some future ideas for future directions, and some cohort projections of the mortality. So again, as with the Techa River, I think we have definitely demonstrated effects of chronic occupational radiation exposure from inhaled plutonium aerosols on lung, liver, and bone cancer, when there were essentially no real risk estimates for this before. I mean, there were some, but they were very crude, and the studies had much lower doses and don't have the kind of power that I think these studies do. We demonstrated effects of external gamma exposure on lung, liver, and bone cancers, and also on other solid cancers, and increased leukemia risks. The risks weren't always consistent with the lifespan study, but they definitely are effects. And I should also comment about I think when we started this is my impression, but I think Nina definitely knew, Nina Kochernikova, who's one of the most amazing people you could ever meet, and is still going strong at 96 years old. She's unstoppable. She knew there would be plutonium effects, that was obvious, but I think she thought we would not really find much in the way of external dose effects. But I was very impressed that when we did, she was very accepting of this and very supportive of us moving ahead. And that was great. She's just an amazing person. Again, we did work on statistical methods and risk models. We had to develop some approach to using this pre-monitoring and post-monitoring data. And it's not only that the workers are unmonitored, but you can estimate doses. If you have monitoring data, you can estimate doses for the years before people were monitored. So people, why don't you do that? Well, you know that people are alive when they had their urinalysis. So you would be counting all this period where there were no deaths. And so you would bias your risk estimates tremendously. So that's one of the great limitations of having a monitoring-based system. And we'll touch on that again later in this talk. And also, again, we had to develop methods for chronic exposures, looking at age and age exposure. So this was sort of across the Techa and the SUBI projects. And then we had to manage and use Monte Carlo dose realizations. The dosimetrists started producing these incredibly complicated and voluminous data where there's 70 years of doses for, not really for each person, but the way you have to store it, there's 70 plus years of doses for each person. There's 20 organs, there's 1,000 realizations, and just managing that. And we sort of were forced to come up with ways that you could effectively use it and develop the methods for using it. So there was a lot of innovative work done here. And again, I think we've provided risk estimates for external gamma and internal alpha exposures that can be used for radiation protection and other purposes, sort of echoing the other. But I think the studies are parallel and have had equal impacts. And I really do hope they play a prominent role moving ahead in radiation protection standard development and UNSCEAR's work too. So recent findings, I'm going to talk about a paper on leukemia, which I hope will be published shortly, and one on liver cancer mortality that should be submitted in the next few months. The cohort, it's the full cohort we've talked about, and I didn't mention this before, but Mikhail, I think, did, 25% women. We have almost 1 million person years of follow-up in the cohort now, and there are 96 non-CLL leukemia deaths and 21 CLL and about 40 or so other types of lymphoid malignancies. And the breakdown, there's about 40, the most common is AML. There's a substantial number that they don't have the type for. Probably a lot of those are also AML. Liver cancer, there's 93 deaths. 21 are in workers with no, or 22. 21 in workers with no plutonium exposure and 29 in workers with plutonium estimates. Those estimates. So we used for, did I get this backward? No, for external doses, we have 5,000 realizations of the 500 realizations per person of the external dose using the MWDS-13, which is all the dose estimates that Mayak provided are from 2008, and everything's based on that. But the Monte Carlo system was developed in 2013, and then in 2016, there was an update, a major update that provided the realizations for the internal exposures based on urinalysis activity. Only the post-monitoring dose estimates are used for the plutonium dose response analyses, but the full cohort is included in all the analyses with the surrogate indicator for pre-monitoring or unmonitored workers. And then we base on, the primary analyses are based on the mean of the individual annual dose rate, annual dose realizations, but then we, you do an adjustment of the confidence intervals for the uncertainty. For leukemia, we find no indication of plutonium effects for non-CLL leukemia, and this echoes what we saw in 2003. And the results, that finding is basically consistent with what we saw earlier. We did find quadratic external ERR dose response with attained age effect modification. The ERR per gray squared at 100 is 0.25. It decreases rapidly, very rapidly with age in proportion to 1 over age to the 4th power. So it's very high if you die early and falls off rapidly. But the most interesting findings concern the pattern with time since the dose was received, or the analog of time since exposure. And here, so if we look at that, we looked at the dose response in 3 time since exposure, time since dose received windows. So the first window is the dose you received in the 2 years prior to dying from leukemia, okay? Then the second window is in the 2 to 5 year period, and the third window is more than 5 or more years. And when we do this, one thing to note is that the power, the attained age power compared to this pure quadratic model before is a little bit less. It's 1 over age cubed rather than 1 over age to the 4.5. But the most striking thing is there are significant dose response in each of these 3 intervals, including this for the doses you received a very short time before you died. So, and one of the reviewers of the paper, more than one, at least one, said, how can you say that? There's only one person who died within 2 years of starting to work. But it isn't within 2 years of starting to work, it's 2 years before you die. And there's a table in the paper that gives the mean doses for cases and non-cases in these periods, and it's very striking, the differences. And also in the lifespan study, there are anecdotal reports because there was no follow-up in that period, but as early as 1947, so 2 years after the bomb, physicians were noting what they thought was increases in childhood leukemia. This is not children, but especially in Nagasaki. So there is some hint that something could be going on, and LSS doesn't address this at all. Anyway, and so that's the main points here, and we better go on. And then let's see, this is that table of the mean doses. So you can see in the 0 to 2 year period, the non-cases, the mean dose was milligray, and in the cases it was 60 milligray, and then 8.6, 186, okay. And in 2 to 5 or more years, it's also higher, 340 versus 670. So there's big increases. Most of the excess cases, of course, come from the 5+ years before exposure, because that's a lot of follow-up. But there are important things going on, and this is a new finding, and I think it's very relevant to discussions of radiation protection and how we looked at things. So, and for liver cancer, I'm not going to say too much, but we're doing a new analysis. We're completing it now, and there are 93 cases. The dose response seems to be basically per gray square. There's a significant linear dose response, but let's see. If you just look at a linear model, but you improve it by going to a nonlinear model, it's basically looks like a pure quadratic. There's a pure quadratic and a linear quadratic. The curves are about the same. if you look at these relative risk estimates, and this is similar to what was in the earlier paper, but the risk estimates in the higher dose categories are huge. The ERR is 500 in the 10 plus gray category, and so basically in that category, virtually all of the cases are due to radiation, most likely. And then this just looks at the lower dose range, and there's, I mean, in terms of significant dose increases, it's not much going on until you get up close to 1 gray, but I don't think one would want to use a threshold. So what can we do in the future? Well, I think what would be important is finalizing the job exposure matrix. We've done some work with that. You can get risk estimates. The advantage of that is you can use the full follow-up for everybody, and it makes it you can have a lot more power to look at effect modification for things like age at initial exposure and stuff. You can look at time since exposure a bit because of that involved, but there's a lot of things you can't look at the way we do things now. Extending the follow-up is really important. Non-cancer mortality analyses, there's definitely suggestions of cardiovascular effects in this cohort, and updated external exposure cancer dose response analyses, and then further development of dose uncertainty methods. And I hope these things can be done by somebody. And finally, I make the same kind of projections for the Mayak cohort. 10% of the men and 15% of the women are alive and not lost to follow-up as of 2016. And there have been about 2,000 cancer deaths. If we look, what do we think over in the next, in 2016, okay. So projecting out to yeah, this is at the beginning of, okay, from 2016 to 24, this is what we've seen to date, 2,700 total deaths. That's not right. Cancer deaths, that's cancer deaths. And then if we look at just men and women, oh no, and then this is what we would project out from, okay, this is projecting from 2016 to 2024. So we predict an additional 138 lung, liver, and bone cancers, an additional 600 solid cancers. And then if we go out another 5 years from 2025 to 2030, we'll see another almost 300 additional cancers. So I think there's still data that could be obtained. I don't think risk estimates will change a lot, but I think it's important to look at these things. And so there's important work still to be done. These cohorts can continue to provide more, and they've provided an awful lot of information to date. And I'd just like to say personally, it was I thank Nina Kochernikova, Leonid Ilyin, Angelina Guskova, and Marina Jogteva in particular for making me want to go do this work in 1990, 1992. And it was a life-changing experience, and I've really enjoyed all the chances I've had to work with my Russian colleagues. And it's a shame that I haven't been able to go when some important things happened. We lost Marina 2 years ago, and Nina's getting old, but she's still there. So, and I'd like to see her again before I leave.
Thank you so much, Dale Preston. We will move on with our agenda, and our next speaker is online, Roy Shore, on behalf of the U.S. Scientific Review Group, and the title of the presentation is "The Future Can Enhance the Past." The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And I don't know how to forward the slide, so maybe someone there will have to do it for me. If we could just move on to the second slide. Well, the scientific review group felt like we ought to be conservative in our recommendations because we don't know what the future holds with regard, especially with regard to US and Russian Federation cooperation. So we mainly talked about what needs to be done with data that are currently available. But then after that, I will talk about some of my thoughts as to what could be done in the future beyond that. So the next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the SRG recommendations, we are certainly urging that the available data now that have been generated but have not yet been published, that we do indeed do careful analyses of those and publish them. And actually, Dr. Preston has already talked about these things in much more detail, so I don't think I need to say much. But the issue of plutonium exposure and the lung, liver, and bone cancers is very important because this cohort has a much broader range of plutonium exposures than other cohorts do, so that it is very informative. With regard to external radiation, we are convinced that that we'd like to see more on leukemia, more on solid cancer, and for the major specific cancer sites to be published with regard to the Mayak PA cohort. And as has already been carefully mentioned, that we would like to see it account for dosimetric uncertainties as well as the typical epidemiologic uncertainties. Next slide, please. For the combined cohort, which represents those who were exposed to Techa River or to the EURT incident in 1957, or both, we believe that it's important to provide the updated cancer mortality data for leukemia, for total solid cancer, and again for major specific cancer sites. And it's not clear if the cancer incidence data have been updated or not, but if so, we would like to see those published as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the issue of the preservation of data, at Oak Ridge, there's a comprehensive epidemiologic data resource, and we think it's important to archive what has been done with regard to this 30 years of study. And so we think that all the historical documents and reports should be preserved, and the published work. And I believe it's important also to put on the metadata, that is what were codes used for various things and what were steps used in deriving some of the various estimates and so on. And where possible, the actual computer programs and of course the analytic results. Now, discussions will need to be undertaken with regard to how much and whether it's appropriate to archive the actual de-identified individual data, which would have to honor the proprietary constraints. But we view it as important to do so if possible. We don't want to see any information lost, and we want to enable future collaborations in a preserved way. The maintenance of the biorepository that now exists at SUBI is very important. It's arguably the best, or one of the 2 or 3 best resources for radiation exposures and biological samples available in the world. That includes many blood determinations and surgical and autopsy tissues of primarily the Mayak workers, but there's also some information on the Ozersk residents as well. And it's an excellent biorepository. And the Georgetown University in the U.S. Georgetown University workers have scientists have also contributed in terms of the developing online programs for people to be able to access find out about the samples so they can determine what samples they would like to request for doing particular studies. So that's very important, and we strongly support that, the maintenance of that biorepository. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'll move on from the official, if you will, recommendations of the SRG to my own thoughts about the future. And I'll say that Dr. Napier already talked about future needs for what he viewed for the dosimetry, and Dr. Preston has talked very extensively about future needs with regard to epidemiology. So I don't need to say very much, but I'll just review briefly thoughts about that. Next slide. Well, I think it's important that additional years of high quality follow-up are conducted of both the Mayak and the Techa River and the EURT trace individuals, and that's what we call the super cohort here. It provides really an increase in precision of the dose response risk estimates. And I noticed from the data that Dr. Preston gave that if there were follow-up until 2030, there would be between 30 and 40% increase in the number of solid cancers, which would really increase the precision of those risk estimates. And in addition, it would provide a lot more data on the lifetime risk, because many cohorts that are available at this time have very limited data when you get to older ages at risk because of relatively short follow-up time. So this is a golden opportunity to increase that informativeness to see how much risk there is at older ages. Next slide. So again, it's a matter of publishing updates for the Mayak PA cohort. We'd like to see updates of the plutonium exposure and the lung, liver, and bone cancers. And I'd like to see a new dose response risk estimates for external radiation and mortality from leukemia, other solid cancers, and major specific cancer sites. And I'd like to make mention that I believe it's important for us to look at the major specific cancer sites that is of interest to the radiation protection community, because there are a number of times that in the radiation world that exposures are not whole body, so that the total solid cancers doesn't necessarily apply directly, but we'd like to know for digestive cancers, for respiratory cancers, and so on and so forth, how much risk there is. So I think trying to document the specific cancer sites is of great importance to add to the scientific literature on that. Next slide. And the same thing holds for the super cohort, which is Techa and the EURT. And if it's possible to update cancer incidence, that would be wonderful. But at least cancer mortality should be updated, and so that there's a real value there in increasing the length of follow-up. Also, the super cohort now includes those with in utero radiation exposure during the years of exposure in Techa River and the EURT. And so it would provide mortality and potentially cancer incidence information following in utero radiation exposure. Now, the literature on that is relatively slim. And so even though it may not be a huge amount of information, it will nevertheless add to the available information database for the radiation protection purposes. Next slide. So that concludes my comments, and I really appreciate that Dr. Napier and Preston already covered these things in much more detail. So I feel like I'm sort of just summarizing the summaries. So thank you very much, and I'll take comments or questions if that's appropriate.
Thank you so much. Any questions? No? Okay, so we will move on. Now we are waiting for the tables. We set up the stage for the panel discussion, and the present speakers will join the stage with our moderator in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
So the way this is going to work is we've provided the speakers some questions in advance for some initial discussion. Then we'll open it up to questions from the floor, and we'll also open it up to questions from our online participants that they can submit through the Q&A feature of the Zoom. So, are we missing anyone? Okay. So we've gotten a few hints from Bruce's presentation and from Dale's presentation as well, but I was hoping to get the speakers, global thoughts on what you see as the major contributions of the Russian Health Studies program. Yes, please, Bruce.
I'll go first because this is a comment that I've kind of that I like to make in this kind of a presentation, and that is that one of the really interesting things that has come out of both the Techa River and the Mayak work is the similarity between the risk estimates that Dale and his friends come up with between the Russian studies and the Japanese lifespan study. And to me, this is actually very, very important, because what it says is that there is not a very big difference between the effects of radiation applied externally and instantaneously, and that applied over a long period of time, perhaps even internally. And why this is so important is that the entire international system of radiation protection is based on the assumption that those two things are similar. And what we have done in the past 30 years is proved that they are similar. And therefore, the entire system of radiation protection actually has a very strong theoretical and technical basis. And so, to me, that's the big thing that has come out of all of this.
Anybody else? Yeah, any other comments?
I would definitely generally agree with Bruce. I mean, there are interesting differences of sorts between the lifespan study and some of these, in Mayak in particular, and even in Techa and some patterns. But yeah, I think the risk estimates are more similar. I think there needs to be a lot more discussion generally about what are the effects of chronic exposure. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. I mean, the risk coefficients, the excess relative risk per gray is let's say it's the same, but the impact, I mean, would you rather be exposed to these exposures chronically over 20 years, or would you rather be exposed at age 20 or at age 40 to that dose? I mean, which, and we have some plots in the paper on leukemia that illustrate that for leukemia, but I think those kind of things need to be discussed a little bit more. It's not about these studies, it's just there needs to be a better understanding of what's the effect of chronic exposure in terms of the actual impact on cancer risks over time compared to acute exposures. And that's an area where we need more. But these studies have been very important for dealing with chronic exposures.
I think from the dosimetry point of view, one of the key things that have come out of the Mayak study is that the Mayak autopsy data has shed considerable light on retention and clearance of material from the lung, which has informed our understanding of lung doses. I think that's probably
biokinetics in general. There's not only the lung model, but also the strontium biokinetics from the Techa River have been incorporated in a lot of the ICRP modeling.
Я хотел бы немножко из истории рассказать нашего исследования.
I would like to say several words about the history of our research.
Но уже в 90-х годах, когда вот произошло рассекречивание информации,
when the information was open to public,
мы начали сотрудничать с РЭРФом, с японскими учеными.
Collaboration with RERF, with the Japanese scientists.
И вот история, она достаточно простая, потому что дозы на мягкие ткани на Тече жители получили примерно такие же, в среднем, средние дозы такие же, как и у переживших атомные бомбардировки в Хиросиме.
History is quite simple because the soft tissue doses the Techa residents received were very similar to the ones the LSS cohort had.
Но эти дозы формировались десятилетия, в отличие от ситуации в Японии.
But the Techa River residents had these doses formed during decades, unlike the LSS cohort.
Ну и тогда возникла идея, что было бы очень важно сопоставить риски, в первую очередь, канцерогенных эффектов.
And then we came to an idea that would be very important and interesting to see how they match the risks of cancerogenic effects.
Но мы, конечно, понимали, что ситуация на реке, она сильно отличается от японской ситуации.
But of course we understood that the situation on the Techa River was very different from the one in Japan.
Потому что у нас было поступление высокой активности стронция внутрь организма людей, и дозы на красный костный мозг были очень высокие.
Because we had high strontium dose to soft tissues and red bone marrow for the Techa residents.
И они были выше средние, чем в когорте переживших атомные бомбардировки.
And they were higher than the mean doses to the people from the survivors.
Но вот эта вот неравномерность распределения дозы, она нами не то чтобы игнорируется, но мы ее всегда принимали во внимание, когда сопоставляли риски с японскими.
And this uneven distribution of dose, we didn't ignore it completely, but we just took it to account when we compared the Techa River doses against the LSS.
И вот, на мой взгляд, очень важно, что до начала российско-американского соглашения, вот я подчеркнул, под руководством Дейла в первую очередь,
And I would like to emphasize that before the Russian-American collaboration, when Dale came into a game,
мы предприняли такие серьезные попытки, чтобы минимизировать различия в качестве информации, которая получалась в Японии по эффектам и дозам, и на Урале у нас.
So we did a lot of efforts to minimize the difference between the information, quality of information we got from Japan and for the Techa River residents.
Ну, понятно, я думаю, всем присутствующим здесь, что это разные системы были информации, качество данных, потому что системы медицинские наблюдения совершенно разные и в Японии, и в России.
Of course, you understand that the system of follow-up and medical observation is absolutely different in Russia and Japan.
Более того, в России в то время, когда мы начинали исследования, не было национальных регистров раковых и вообще регистров смерти.
Moreover, in Russia back then, we didn't have any national cancer registers or any death causes registers.
И поэтому наш институт всю эту работу проводил самостоятельно.
That's why URCRM took this on its shoulders and did everything independently.
Ну и вот Дейл нас как бы справедливо ориентировал на поиски наиболее надежных источников информации.
And Dale was kind enough to guide us towards the most, the best sources of information.
Верификацию случаев заболеваний и смерти.
And thanks to him, we had this verification of death causes.
Ну и, конечно, значительные усилия были предприняты по унификации хранения информации и анализа данных.
And of course, we took great efforts in systematizing information on the causes of death and verifications.
Ну, я думаю, что мы достигли вот максимально того, что мы могли сделать.
I think we reached the maximum we could.
Дело в том, что в России была государственная система регистрации первичных случаев заболеваний раком.
In Russia, back then we had this federal program for primary causes of cancers back then.
Да, и мы использовали как раз в основу информации о случаях заболеваний как раз вот эту государственную
программу. So we used this federal program as a base for our storage and for our archive and all systems.
Ну и в последующем, как вы слышали из докладов, мы предпринимали попытки расширения территории наблюдения.
And subsequently, as you heard from the reports, we enlarged and extended the catchment areas.
Просто сегодня не было возможности детально рассказать.
We didn't have an opportunity to tell it go into bigger detail today.
Ну, к примеру, хочу сказать, что сначала заболеваемость у нас раковая оценивалась в пределах Челябинска и 5 районов Челябинской области.
Just to start with, I would say that the catchment area first only covered 5 areas, 5 regions of Chelyabinsk region.
И 2 в Курганской области.
And 2 in Kurganskая область.
Ну, а к концу наблюдения у нас территория наблюдения была расширена до включения полностью Челябинской и Курганской областей.
And by the end of the follow-up, the catchment area included the whole Chelyabinsk area and the whole Kurgan area.
Ну, это, в общем-то, большие усилия предпринимались для того, чтобы улучшить качество отслеживания эффектов.
So we did go an extra mile to improve the quality of follow-up.
И сегодня мы вам представили данные, которые получены по результатам вот многолетнего такого сотрудничества, которое уже развивалось в рамках российско-американского соглашения.
And today you saw the results. We presented the results which were obtained during this Russian-American collaboration, which was very productive.
Ну и вы слышали, что большие усилия предпринимались по индивидуализации доз облучения членов когорты.
And of course you could come to the conclusion that we took an extra effort in individual dose assessment and dose estimate.
Ну, что в результате получилось, да, ну, наверное, МКРЗ эти данные могли бы заинтересовать.
I think that as a result, ICRP could be interested in this data.
Потому что и там мы имеем дело с населением.
Because in both cases, in both situations, we deal with population.
Разного возраста,
age,
состояние здоровья,
vital status,
пола.
Sex.
Ну, этнические особенности, конечно, есть, да?
And with some ethnic differences and peculiarities.
Они тоже влияют на спонтанный уровень заболеваний, канцерогенных.
Cancer morbidity.
Их тоже надо принимать во внимание.
We also should take them into account.
Ну, а с учетом дозы, конечно, того, что дозы были сопоставимы, по крайней мере, средние, то можно сказать, что вот для анализа именно фактора мощности дозы.
Since the mean doses were comparable, we can say that the dose rate factor.
Но вот эти данные представляют определенный интерес.
These data are of a certain interest.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, Werner.
Yes, thank you very much. No, the idea was that ICRP is on the floor tomorrow. But you said so many important things that I thought I should give at least a brief comment. As Dale already mentioned in his presentation, 20 years ago, when ICRP prepared for publication 103, indeed, everything was relied on the LSS data at that time. Nowadays, it's so exciting because now we have a new situation, because now we have data, epidemiological data, on low dose rate studies. And the Techa River population is one study, the studies on the Mayak workforce is one. There are others, nuclear workers, in-work study, the 1 million person study in the US. Even there are more. So now this is really exciting from the perspective of ICRP, because we can now have a look whether the basic assumption at that time that we have risks also at low dose rate exposures was true or not. And in a way, I would agree with what you said, Bruce. The risks which come out of the new study, of the low dose rate studies, are similar. You didn't say the same, but similar. And I would fully agree. They are similar. Whether this would include a difference in a factor of 2 or so, that's a different story, because we all know that the uncertainties behind the risk estimates coming from each of those studies are still appreciable, I would say. We cannot ignore those. Now that's why, as you probably also know, and I will present this tomorrow, ICRP has a task group 91, which explicitly looks at dose rate and low dose effectiveness factors. And our philosophy is that we look at all the available evidence now, and tomorrow I will give you the recent results of this task group. I have just 8 minutes, so I take the opportunity now to make the introduction already. So this is why it's so exciting at the moment. And I would really emphasize that now we definitely know that, let's say, a dose of 100 milligray has an effect, whether it was given acutely, like in the lifespan study, or protracted over several years or even decades. We know that now. It's a proof. So no one can ignore that. I know people who still try to ignore it, but this is a proof. And as such, the data we saw today cannot be, I mean, they are so valuable for our current work in ICRP. Tomorrow you will hear more about that, but that was just the intro or the appetizer for tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Werner. We heard some, individual presentations of, or individual suggestions of scientific questions of interest that could be addressed in the future, but I was wondering if the panelists could comment on any sort of large scale or global scientific questions or issues that remain unaddressed or unresolved by the program. Not yet.
I think that one question has to do with effect modification on plutonium doses, because of this limitation that you basically using the urinalysis, and you can only really start follow-up for dose response estimation or effect modification estimation from the time 2 years after the person is monitored, because of the nature of the monitoring program. You can't answer a lot of questions about age effects, age at exposure effects and things like that, because you just don't have all the history you can use. So I think that would be a very interesting area to pursue, and we began working on it, but unfortunately haven't completed it. We did. So that would be an area, again, as I said before, I think for radiation protection purposes, it's important that these risk estimates are similar to the acute and chronic, but again, the effects of chronic exposure, just because of the nature of the chronic exposure, are different. And how does a radiation protection system distinguish, or should it distinguish, between acute and chronic exposure? Not because of differences in the risk per unit dose, but just in what you expect over time from these two things. So I think that's an important, more general question is still out there. And I will stop.
Okay. I think one of the key points from the dosimetry perspective is to complete or to complete the job exposure matrix, because that has a capacity to greatly increase the power of the study. I think a lot of progress has been made, but there are still problems about the if you take a sort of test cohort and that you have data for, and then you calculate their doses from the gem, you don't get a perfect match, and there's still something going on that we don't quite understand. But I think we need to sort of sort that out somehow.
Ну, на самом деле здесь еще есть одна проблемка, вот о которой я начал говорить, именно неравномерность облучения когорты реки Течи.
Again, well, there's a small issue. Well, I've started about it, and it's uneven exposure to the Techa River population.
В свое время мы с Альбрехтом Келлером эту проблему обсуждали не раз.
Back nowadays, Albrecht Keller and I were discussing this problem.
Дело в том, что вот на сессии последней АНСКЭ мы обсуждали проект, связанный с действием радиации на иммунную систему.
The last ANSCER session, we were discussing a project related to the radiation effect on immune system.
Ну, я считаю, что проект действительно очень важный.
And I think it's a very important project.
Вот мы сейчас как бы все понимаем, и многие пишут при анализе различных эффектов о роли иммунной системы.
We all understand the role of immune system, and there are many papers now about it.
Но здесь вот есть несколько проблем таких. Первая проблема состоит в том, что иммунология сейчас очень быстро развивается.
The first issue with this topic is that immunology is a very fast developing science.
И сейчас очень много информации вот о этой сложной системе, чрезвычайно сложной системе, не только по эффекторному звену, но особенно вот по регуляторной системе.
And there is a lot of information now about this complex system, not the effect only, but the regulatory system as well.
И, честно говоря, вот что мы сейчас на сегодняшний момент имеем?
So what we have at the moment.
Мы знаем о развитии вторичных иммунодефицитов после облучения в костно-мозговых дозах при остром облучении.
We know about the effects of secondary effects of immunodeficiency after the exposure.
Но я не знаю ни одного исследования, где бы было проведено аналогичное исследование, как, допустим, по заболеваемости и смертности от рака, эпидемиологическое исследование, где бы анализировался риск вторичных иммунодефицитов при дозах, которые не вызывают острый лучевой синдром.
But I'm not aware of any paper, any analysis of like we do for the epidemiological purposes in our project that would analyze the secondary effects of the immunological system.
Иммунную систему, да. Достаточно много таких небольших работ, они в основном клинические работы, на маленьких группах выполненные.
There are several works like this, but they're medical works and they only cover small groups of patients.
Они однократные проводятся исследования, непроспективные исследования.
They're only singular researches and they're don't have any future.
И очень трудно понять роль иммунной системы в развитии радиационно-индуцированных эффектов на самом деле.
It's very difficult to understand the role of immune system in development of radiation-induced effects.
К чему я это говорю?
What I'm leading to.
Когда мы говорим о когорте реки Теча, мы должны понимать, что здесь могут быть явления абскопального эффекта.
When we're talking about the Techa River population, we can keep in mind that there might be some abscopal effects,
связанные с развитием иммунодефицитных состояний,
related to the development of immunodeficiency situations or status,
которые могут предрасполагать действительно к развитию
which could make you prone to the development.
Не только канцерогенных, но и хронических нераковых заболеваний.
Chronic non-cancer diseases.
Поэтому вот проблема, конечно, вот о которой я остановился, она очень важная.
This is the problem I would like to emphasize. It's very important.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Next, I was wondering if, sorry.
This is Roy Shore. I wondered if I could make a comment or two.
Yes, please, Roy.
One of the issues that has been sort of a puzzle to me, at least, has been that when we do studies such as the Russian studies we're talking about, one has three different measurements that one needs to think about. One is the age at exposure. One is the age at the risk that occurs, and the third is the interval between the exposure and the risk. And we've tended to concentrate on the first two, but we haven't done very much with regard to interval from exposure to risk. And I'm not talking about just this study, but that's generally true in the epidemiologic literature. And I think it's important for us to look at that and see how well or the importance of the length of time since the exposure occurred. But obviously we would have to adjust in a careful way for the age at the occurrence of the cancers, because everyone knows that age at cancer is a very important factor because it varies so much with age. But I think we need to give more attention to the duration of time since the exposure occurred. The other point is that the SUBI has a really valuable group of biospecimens which have been underutilized to date by the radiation community. And SUBI has been very active in trying to publicize the fact that they have that biorepository, but there have not been a whole lot of biologists who've been interested in it and have tried to do studies. They're much more oriented, I guess, toward doing mouse studies and so on in terms of biological impacts of radiation. But I think there's a lot that could potentially be learned, and I think Dr. Akleyev addressed that in a measure, at least, that I'd really like to see biologists take on human studies and looking at the biological factors. And with regard to other kinds of exposures, especially the European community has been making advances in trying to understand the biology of the risk. And I think we need to do more with humans, studies of radiation as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. I was wondering if the panelists could briefly comment on any innovations, be they technical or methodological or otherwise, that have been developed as part of the program that either have been beneficial or would be beneficial to apply in other radiation studies. Have they not yet been applied?
I think the work on dose uncertainty, the idea of developing these Monte Carlo dosimetry systems, I mean, in the past, people said, oh, we'll give you a dose and we'll give you an uncertainty, a number, a GSD or whatever for each dose. And that's not very useful, actually. And this Monte Carlo dosimetry is useful. I think the methods for applying it, there's a lot of discussion there. There's work going on, publish something comparing a couple of different methods sometime soon. And NCRP just put out a report on dose uncertainty adjustment. But I think that's an area where, but I also think for that, we need to think more about how do you characterize the uncertainties that go into this Monte Carlo dosimetry. And I think, as I alluded to, I think it needs a real effort, a combined effort of epidemiologists, statisticians, and dosimetrists to really address that. I think that's been important. I think the advances in how we model these chronic exposures, some of these, talked about time since exposure effects, and we do, like in the leukemia, and that's what we're looking at. The analog is time since the dose was received. But, and that the methods aren't perfect. We use these dose windows. You might experiment with smoothing that pattern. But I think there's interesting information there. And there's certainly, for leukemia, certainly there's patterns that are of interest. And I think probably very real patterns that aren't surprising, but I think that's been an innovation. We've just learned a lot about how to do this modeling and fit these models and things like that. That's come out of that. And we have tools that have been developed that are used fairly widely. Developed, I mean, some of it for the A-bomb survivors, but here, and we had to extend those or think about how to use those for chronic exposures. And that's been very important. And I think Bruce can, or Richard can say something about dosimetry, because I think there's a lot of innovation there.
Okay, do you want to take it?
I'm just a dosimetrist, but I have learned a lot about how uncertainties are characterized and propagated, and it's not frequently done. I started doing it and learned an awful lot by making a number of mistakes back in the early 90s with the Hanford dose reconstruction, which Dan Stram actually started the thought of how to use those uncertainties in a risk estimate at that time, and it has evolved since then. There are things that I would probably do differently now. We actually have two fairly, I mean, they're similar, but they're different approaches between the Techa River and the Mayak workers, because there are different types of measurements. So, we use a whole body count. We used a whole lot of whole body counts to create an intake function that we then apply to people. The Mayak workers have individual urinalyses, so they have measured intakes. It's a difference between measuring something in a body and measuring something coming out of the body to come back to what went into the body to start with. So there's an awful lot of development that could occur and will occur over the years on internal and external dosimetry as well. Say anything?
No, I think you said all right.
Я с Дейлом согласен. Конечно, главный элемент такой инновационный в нашем исследовании была идея оценка неопределенности радиационного риска рака.
Yeah, I agree with Dale, and the main innovation was the estimate of dose estimate for radiation risk, cancer risk.
На основе учета неопределенности доз.
Those uncertainties.
Вот, это, конечно, очень важно, но, к сожалению, мы эту работу не закончили.
It is important, but unfortunately we didn't complete this task.
Но я также думаю, что эти исследования очень важны для совершенствования моделей радиационного канцерогенеза.
But I think this is very important to complete and create models for radiation carcinogenic systems. Things.
Ну, вот эту работу мы в свое время с Питером Якобом начинали, в том числе вот на теченских данных.
We started this job with Peter Jacob, and we tested it on the Techa data.
Ну, там была достаточно простая модель.
But it was a quite simple model.
Да. Но многие, как я понимаю, факторы, которые вот сейчас мы понимаем, как сейчас канцерогенез при хроническом облучении.
And many factors, as we know now, as cancerogenic at chronic exposure.
Они работают несколько иначе, чем при остром облучении.
They work differently than those from acute exposure.
И поэтому это как раз представляет перспективу для совершенствования модели канцерогенеза при хроническом облучении.
Could be a future perspective for studying cancerogenic effects in the future models.
I think I have one more question, but I think we'll open up to questions from the floor.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the vast amount of information shared with us. I was in Chelyabinsk before, but I didn't realize that was so much information, so valuable. I have an ignorant question. I apologize for that. In all the presentations, I didn't saw that the basic data has been checked against log normal distribution. And I mention this because in the Chernobyl work and also in the Fukushima work, we did that with basic data. And without any exception, every time that the data didn't fit a log normal distribution, there was something wrong with the data. I just asked this question. Sorry for the question. It's very, very primitive, if you like, and very simple, but I would like to know.
Yeah, I can't give a very complete answer on this, but there are a few test cases which I did the QA on to compare Pandora calculations with IMBA calculations. And one of those had a fairly extensive number of non-LOD results. So I thought it would be interesting to feed that into, I actually fed it into the Software Pro UCL. And it did turn out to be a pretty good log normal distribution. And furthermore, with a GSD which corresponded fairly closely with what the SUBI team were assuming for it. So that's only one case, but at least that's a little bit of an indication that maybe the data really is log normally distributed, but there's certainly more work that could be done on that.
And I'll also say that not all, but many or most of the distributions that go into the different dosimetric models are essentially log normal as well.
I've also, over the years, obviously looked at Harvard data because that's where I work. And where you have people who've been exposed a long time ago, so the current level of excretion is fairly flat. If you just look at the distribution about that flat level for Harvard data, it looks pretty good, pretty well like a log normal distribution.
Say something about that.
Microphone.
It's sort of, you know, as things become normal, you know, when you add things together, you get the law of large numbers kicks in, and you get, or the central limit theorem. And what you're seeing is the central limit theorem operating on the log scale. And that leads to, if you have multiplying components together, then you will end up with a limiting distribution will be the log normal. Under certain assumptions.
And if you look at the individual doses within all of these cohorts, after applying all of our uncertainty analyses, they're all log normal.
Yeah, thanks. Next question.
Thank you so much. I thought it was really interesting presentations. So thank you to you all for that. I was interested in some of the issues related to what was called the pre-monitoring period, both sort of the characterization about it, and in particular this observation of what appeared to be health-related selection into internal monitoring, which is different than typically the processes that would be thought about in other facilities, where the decision to pull someone into an internal monitoring program would be based on location and job duty, for example, but not health-related selection, and specifically poor health-related selection into the internal monitoring program.
I thought when we started that this was some sort of random program, or based on, you know, you would oversample specific departments and things like that. But as we saw this, it was clear that there were sort of two things going on. I think they were sampling departments and stuff like that, but they were also, if somebody had some symptom, they were more likely to be monitored. So that led to this system, this choice to say, look, just because you're monitored, you aren't going to start using their doses from that date, because it's pretty clear that the risks are really high in that period. So yeah, I think it was not a random sample or a what do you call it, a weighted sampling scheme. There was a combination of things going on, and wouldn't say it's unfortunate. It's what we have to live with. I mean, and also the monitoring didn't begin till long after the exposures in most cases. Really, the monitoring, there was some in the 70s, but it was more in the 80s and 90s that you begin to see a lot of the monitoring. So you've also got this problem that it's a long time, and then you have to reconstruct. You measure the urine in 1990, and you have to reconstruct what when they receive these doses in time. I mean, it's a really complicated problem, and it's complicated more because of this unusual selection.
Health-related selection into exposure. And just to follow up on that, you've talked about the pre-period for the plutonium. Is there a pre-monitoring period for neutrons? Is there a pre-monitoring period for gamma exposures?
No, because gamma exposures, it's largely film batch based.
And that was uniform and complete beginning at the start of operations.
I mean, there's some people that they reconstructed doses based on workplace, but it's a pretty small fraction of the total population. And neutrons, there's limited information on neutrons, actually. We don't do much with neutrons in the Mayak workers, because I think in certain workplaces they could have neutron exposures, but the information is very weak. So that's a limitation, I think, of the study. It should be able to try to do more with neutron exposures.
And there's a response from one of the online speakers.
No, it's a question.
We'll get to those. Thanks. Yep.
Hi, it's Richard Wakeford. I was just continuing that theme, actually. I was going to talk about this anyway. But yeah, I mean, there is no doubt that the Southern Urals populations have contributed enormously. And I've worked with the Mayak data as part of the SOLO project, the EU SOLO project. And of course, I mean, we've heard a lot of effort has been put into the plutonium doses and the uncertainties surrounding it. Dale and Dan have worked a lot on this, and I was just wondering about the uncertainties on the external doses as well. And Mayak data are very important for the DREF issues. The comparisons between the lifespan study and the Mayak data and other workforces. I noted that on one of the slides that, for example, that the latest external dose uncertainty we're not really up to date. I mean, a lot of the work was done, I know, about 20 odd years ago, but it would be very useful for our deliberations in ICRP, and Werner's already talked about the sort of work that's being done to compare the lifespan study with chronic exposures, protracted exposures. Could we have an update paper on the uncertainties in the external dosimetry as we've moved to the 2013 and maybe further now system? It would be very nice to have that so that you could get a feel about how the uncertainties in the external doses might feed into dose estimates. Thank you.
Richard has pestered me about this over the years.
I wasn't a reviewer of your paper.
There is a paper that was drafted and submitted for publication with the MWDS 2013 series. It never got published because we got tangled up with a reviewer. Actually, Richard, one of the things that we've thought about doing and haven't gotten around to yet, but we were hoping to do it soon, was to actually put that paper out on a preprint server where you could actually see it and people could use it. It would begin to address what you're after, because when Mayak stopped working with us in 2009, we never really got any new information. And so the 2013 numbers, as Alexander said, are kind of retrofit to what existed in 2008. We used everything that they wrote about uncertainty, and then we actually applied it to their numbers. But it would be nice to have more.
Are the reviewers' comments really that bad that you can't do? Well, can't you just, can't you continue?
This question came up with the leukemia manuscript about documenting the Monte Carlo uncertainties, and I proposed, and I think that this actually, as Bruce said, that it go on an archive server. But when we resubmitted the paper, we said we would make a copy of that available, and there will be a way somebody can get a copy of that once this paper is out. as a supplementary material or whatever you want to call it. It's not formally that, but we have a link that you can download it from, and hopefully it'll be up on an archive server at some point, so there'll be a more official way to get it. But I think it is important that paper get out because it's a black box. Even with these papers, it's a bit of a black box, but it's even more of a black box without them.
To continue on the topic of uncertainties, and in the presentation by Mikhail Sokolnikov, we saw that the level of exposure has been varying a lot during the times, and with some deterministic effects at the beginning. And so we can consider that the early years were very different from the rest. Roy Shaw was saying that one of the main points to look at is the time since exposure, but I think the period of exposure should be considered also as a modifying factor. It's of great interest today in the interpretation of the worker studies, and for Mayak it could be very interesting also to look at what's if we exclude the early years, in which we can consider that the uncertainties were clearly the largest ones, and to consider a period of exposure which is more homogeneous could be very, very interesting also. So maybe that's something that can be considered. And the second point is that in the presentation, everything has been focused on the risk of cancer, but there are also very interesting results for non-cancer effects that have been obtained from the Mayak workers. So I think all the works that have been done in the improvement of the dosimetry and the follow-up and so on has been helpful also for non-cancer disease.
I think definitely there needs to be some papers, additional papers soon, and I think they should be done soon, on non-cancer mortality in both cohorts. I think this is very important. And because the papers that have been published and things we've looked at suggest that there are some interesting effects there. And that's very important because these are chronic low dose rate exposures. And if you're seeing non-cancer effects, that's an interesting issue for radiation protection. I mean, they are not in the magnitude of cancer effects in an absolute sense, but they're important.
I think there was a question in the front.
That's a question from one of the online participants. To what extent have Mayak workers also environmental exposure been included in the total dose estimation?
The short answer is no. We did look at the noble gas releases from the reactors and other things, and most of the environmental exposures to the workers would have been small. The only one that's probably significant, again, would be thyroid dose, because the iodine was leaving the plant, going down immediately to the collective farms that supplied milk to the entire city. And so, you know, it's unfortunate that that particular part of the program stopped about 15 years ago. I mean, we made as much use of it as we could for the Techa River people, but it would be nice to apply it to the residents of Ozersk as well.
There was a project, I think it was part of the NCI thing. I get them all mixed up because they got run together, but that we looked at people born during periods when the releases were believed to be large releases from Mayak, people born in Ozersk in that period, and compared to people who were the same age but moved to Ozersk after that period. And there were definitely suggestions that there was an elevated thyroid cancer risk for that. But we needed the thyroid doses, and as of yet, there's no thyroid doses for the general population. And Mikhail Sokolnikov has done some other looking at different areas in the city where, in the closed territory, where there's some little villages that people had their own cows and goats early on. And again, it's suggestions that the rates were much higher there. So there's very interesting data that could provide useful information if we had thyroid doses.
I guess the question is because it's difficult to differentiate people working and living in the same area. So
Yeah, I think thyroid is an area where you could probably learn something. But yes, it is it's just like another analog of that is the prenatal exposures for the people on the Techa that also had postnatal exposures. That's a very challenging problem. And, but there are some people that had prenatal, parents were exposed and then they left and maybe still live in Chelyabinsk, so we know where they are and they have some information. So there's a possibility of having some children who didn't have pre and postnatal exposures. But again, it's a challenging problem because you have all these different exposures going on.
So the hour is getting late, but I wanted to take the prerogative of ending with one of my questions. And that's, as we celebrate 30 years of a very successful program, what do you think has made the program so successful? And what related advice might you have for others who are pursuing similar international collaborations?
From the point of view of the dosimetrists, it's been the collaboration. I mean, it's mutual respect and working together to understand how things are done. When I first went to Chelyabinsk and started on Project 1.1, my mindset was still on the traditional release, dispersion, biological accumulation, and dose. I got completely turned upside down when I met Marina Dyokteva. And so, I had to change my outlook, and I think that we had some impact on this, on them as well. So it's the working together and understanding what's going on and making the most use of the available information that makes it worthwhile.
I agree. I mean, it's the development of these sort of personal relations with these people that have made this so successful. I mean, the respect we have for each other and the understanding that, we're all contributing something very important to this, and that these country differences, political differences don't matter, in this case, and nobody's trying to use it for their own gain. It's a scientific purpose. I think it's amazing that these studies can continue so long, and because it's hard to maintain, and even to maintain funding. And I think it's on the U.S. side, it's very grateful to the NCI for 12 years of funding. I should say, when I started, one of the appealing things, I'd been working with Viktor Ivanov and others in Obninsk, but the people in Marina and others, they said, we don't need money. We just want scientists, scientific things. The situation changed. Don't get me wrong, but that was very refreshing after a situation where everybody was looking for money, and there was a lot of money flowing into Chernobyl. But for me, and also for me, the appeal was it was long-term. You had the long-term follow-up, and these cohorts had been established, and there was something you could work with. And I want to say, it's off this subject, that we really should be grateful to Mira Kosenko and Nina Kochernikova for their efforts to establish these cohorts. And I think it can't be underestimated. I don't think there was a lot of broad support, especially in Ozersk, for making a cohort of workers to do epidemiological follow-up. I think Nina, those of you who've met her know she's like a force of nature, but it took somebody like that to make this happen. And I think probably with the Techa River, it also was similar, but I think we have to be very grateful for those people that in the 70s and 80s realized that they should do this and make it happen. And that's what I think made it attractive to me. And also in the dosimetry, as Bruce said, I think Marina and her group were amazing at what they had done with very limited resources. And it laid a foundation that we could all build on together. And like I said, it's been a very important part of my life to be engaged with these great scientists.
Ну, я согласен со своими американскими коллегами.
I completely agree with my American colleagues.
Я бы хотел добавить, что, конечно, мы бы и сами эту работу сделали.
And I would like to add that we could do it independently, of course.
Но, конечно, это была бы другая работа.
But surely it was a very different work. It would be,
Ну, вот я хотел бы подчеркнуть, что участие Дейлов
and I
в
would like to
исследованиях в
emphasize that
Хиросиме и на
Dale's
Урале,
participating in Hiroshima and in the Ural research.
оно было особенно полезно, потому что
It was
вот
especially
это
useful
позволило
because
унифицировать подходы
let us
в обеих
unify
странах.
the approaches for the both countries.
Ну и зная Дейла, ну, я думаю,
knowing
многие
Dale,
знают Дейла,
and I'm sure you all know Dale.
он с большой душой
He puts his soul
и в Японии работал, и
into both
на Урале.
Japan and the Urals,
И на самом деле его вклад был очень
and
существенный.
his contribution was the very significant one.
Я бы так сказал, что вот это сотрудничество,
say
оно
that
стало
this
таким
collaboration-
мощным катализатором,
It was a very powerful catalyst,
который позволил нам, конечно
which of
же,
course allowed us to
выполнить эту работу
perform
быстрее.
this task faster.
И самое главное, что вот, на мой взгляд, сейчас
And the most
результаты
important is that the
исследования
results of the
Хиросимы и
research in
Нагасаки и
Hiroshima
наши,
and
их
Nagasaki
действительно можно
and ours,
сопоставлять.
they are comparable now.
Потому что ну, мы максимум старались сделать того,
Because
чтобы они
we
были
did our
сопоставимы.
best to make them comparable.
Ну и, конечно же, вот мы стали не просто коллегами, а
Of course, we are
друзьями,
not only colleagues, but during these 30 years we became friends,
и это тоже очень важно.
and this is very important as well.
On that note, please join me in thanking our panelists.
So this just leaves me to finish for today. Thank you all for coming today, and please do not forget tomorrow morning we will continue, and then you also will hear a lot more about ICRP's view as well, in addition to the continued discussions among the projects we are because of which we are here. So thank you very much. See you tomorrow morning.